How did ancient smiths achieve the impossible structural integrity of the Ulfberht blade? Tonight, we trace the chemical fusion of slag and ore through the patient, quiet art of pattern welding. Watch as the metallic stillness takes hold, layering high-carbon steel into a masterpiece designed to help you fade into sleep. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here, the fires of history burned low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Chapter 1. The Sleeping Village and the Old Master's Fire. Close your eyes, little one, and let the world grow quiet around you. Let the sounds of today fade the rush and clatter of the living world, until all that remains is the soft hiss of wind moving over frozen ground, the distant groan of ice on a dark river, and the smell of wood smoke rising from a longhouse into a sky so full of stars it looks like scattered embers from a god's forge. This is the North. This is the old world, and this is where our story begins. The village of Keldvik sat in a shallow bowl between two ridges of black pine, cradled by the land the way a cupped hand holds water. It was not a large village, perhaps 40 longhouses arranged in no particular order, their sod roofs heavy with the first snowfall of the season, their walls thick with packed earth and the memories of many winters. Dogs slept curled at doorways, cattle shifted in their enclosures, their warm breath rising in pale clouds. The river that fed the village had narrowed since summer, its banks edged now with a fringe of grey ice that thickened a little more each night. By the time the moon reached the top of its long climb over the eastern ridge, Keldvik was sleeping. The fires inside the longhouses had been banked low, their orange glow reduced to a slow red pulse beneath ash and turf. Mothers lay curled around children. Warriors, broad-shouldered and calloused, snored under their furs. The old and the young and the middling, all of them had given themselves to the mercy of sleep, as they did every night when the cold came down from the mountains and made the world small and still and dark. All of Keldvik slept, except for one. At the far end of the village, set slightly apart from the other buildings, the way a man of particular work is always set slightly apart, stood the smithy of Halvard Ironhand. It was smaller than the longhouses, lower and squarer, built close to the ground as though it were trying to hold itself down against the pull of something fierce inside it. And from its single smoke hole in the turf roof, fire climbed, not the low, patient glow of a banked hearth, but real fire, living fire, the kind that breathed and leaned and threw orange light across the snow in wavering, dancing shapes. Halvard was awake. Halvard was always awake at this hour. He was not a tall man. Age had taken what height he once possessed and pressed it down through his spine, so that he now stood at a slight stoop, as though carrying something invisible across his shoulders, which, in a way, he was. His hands were the first thing anyone ever noticed about him. Enormous, scarred across every knuckle, the skin darkened permanently by decades of forge smoke and iron dust, the fingers thick as rope and just as strong. His left thumb had been lost to an accident 30 years before, cleaved away by a chisel that slipped on a winter morning just like this one, and in its place was a smooth knob of scar tissue that he sometimes pressed against cooling metal to feel its temperature. His beard was iron grey, worn short and practical, and his eyes, pale blue, almost silver, were the eyes of a man who had spent his life looking into very bright things. He stood at his forge now, one hand resting on the stone lip of the hearth, watching the coals breathe. The bellows, two great leather lungs mounted on a wooden frame, were at rest for the moment. The charcoal glowed in that deep, interior orange that means a fire is ready, not frantic but committed, holding its heat the way a patient man holds a thought. On the anvil behind him lay a piece of iron no longer than his forearm, waiting, just waiting. He was not working yet. He was thinking. This was the part of the smith's craft that no one who had not lived it would ever fully understand. The long, still thinking that preceded the strike of the hammer. It looked like doing nothing. It looked like an old man staring into a fire. But inside Halvard's mind, shapes were moving. The grain of the metal, the sequence of heats, the number of folds, the final form the blade would take as it emerged from everything that was about to happen to it. He was building the sword in his mind before he built it in iron. Because iron, once struck, remembers you cannot unhit a piece of metal. You cannot take back a fold that went wrong. The only true forge was the one behind the eyes, and the work done there was the most important work of all. His name, Ironhand, had been given to him by the men of the village when he was still young. Before the accident with his thumb, before the lines had gathered so deeply around his eyes. It was not given ironically or as mockery. It was given the way Viking names always were, as simple, honest description. He was the hand of iron. He was the one through whom iron spoke. In Kjellvik, as in every Norse village of that age, the smith held a position unlike any other. He was not a jarl, not a warrior, not a priest, and yet he stood at the center of all three of those things. The weapons that the warriors carried into battle came from his hands. The tools that the farmers used to break the earth came from his hands. The nails that held the longships together, the hooks that hung the cooking pots, the hinges on every door in the village, all of it was Halvard. All of it was the forge. The Norse people of the 9th and 10th centuries understood something that the people of later, more complicated ages would sometimes forget, that the man who shapes the material world is not separate from the world of spirit and meaning. Halvard knew this. He had been taught it by his master, who had been taught it by his master before that, in an unbroken chain of knowledge, stretching back to a time before writing. The forge was sacred. Not sacred in the way that a temple is sacred, hushed and distant and off limits, but sacred in the way that a living thing is sacred. The forge had moods. The forge had memory. If you came to it with careless hands and a distracted heart, it would give you careless work. If you came to it with attention and patience and something approaching reverence, it would give you back something greater than what you had put in. Outside, a dog barked once, and then went quiet. Snow sifted against the smithy wall. Halvard reached out and took the iron piece from the anvil and turned it in the firelight, studying it with the whole of his attention, the way you might study the face of someone you were about to make a promise to. Then he set it gently back, breathed once, deeply, and reached for the bellows. The fire surged. He would work until the iron told him to stop. And the iron, tonight, had a great deal it wanted to say. Across the village, in the largest longhouse, an old woman sat near a low fire with 3 children arranged around her like fallen leaves, 2 girls and a boy, the youngest no more than 5, already fighting sleep with the stubborn heaviness of eyelids that would not stay up no matter how hard their owner tried. The old woman's name was Astrid, and she was Halvard's sister. Though she had lived a different kind of life entirely, she had married young, buried a husband, raised children, and grown old in the way that some women grow old, which is to say not smaller but larger, more settled in themselves, more certain of the things that matter. She had been telling the children something, and now she paused, tilting her head as though listening. From far away, carried faintly through the still cold air, came the first distant ring of Halvard's hammer against the anvil. Even muffled by snow and distance, it had a particular quality, clear and purposeful, like a single word spoken in a quiet room. The children heard it too. Their eyes, which had been drooping, opened a little. "Is that Uncle Halvard?" the boy asked. "It is," said Astrid. She settled back, pulling her shawl tighter. "He is at the forge, in the dark." "The dark doesn't matter to your uncle," said Astrid. "He works by firelight. The fire is always there." "What is he making?" asked one of the girls. Astrid looked at the fire for a moment. The hammer rang again, far away, and then again, settling into a slow, steady rhythm that almost sounded like a heartbeat, if you listened long enough. "That," she said, "is a question worth a story." She pulled the smallest child closer, felt the warmth of the small body against her side, and let her voice drop to the particular register she used for the telling of important things. Not theatrical, not loud, but steady and low and unhurried, like water moving under ice. "Let me tell you about iron," she said. "Let me tell you about the men who learned to talk to it. And let me tell you about a sword that was made only once in a generation, in a forge like your uncle's, by hands like his, a sword so perfectly made that warriors 100 years apart would speak of it in the same breath, with the same word on their lips. Are you listening? Then close your eyes. The story lives in the dark." The fire settled, the hammer rang, and the story began. Halvard did not think of himself as a man who did remarkable things. This was, in itself, one of the most remarkable things about him. He had been making iron objects for 51 years, since the age of 8, when his own master, a man named Bjorn Skullbreaker, who had been neither particularly skull-like nor particularly breaking in his demeanor, had first set a pair of tongs in his child hands and shown him how to hold a piece of iron in a fire without flinching. In those 51 years he had made axes and arrowheads, hinges and hooks, buckles and bridle bits, nails beyond counting, a dozen ship anchors, scores of knives, 4 boat holes worth of rivets, and somewhere in the middle of all that, on 3 separate occasions spread across his working life, he had made an Ulfberht sword, 3 times, not counting the one he was about to begin. The first had been when he was 32, newly come into his full strength, his hands still quick and his eyes still sharp as a hawk's. He had spent 4 months on that blade, and when it was finished he had stood and looked at it for a long time without speaking, which was his way of saying that it was as close to right as he knew how to make it. It had gone to a jarl to valleys distant, a broad, quiet man who had paid for it with a small herd of cattle and had carried it for 20 years before dying of fever in his bed, which was not the way anyone who knew him had expected him to go. The sword had passed to his son, and then his son's son, and Halvard had sometimes wondered on nights like this one, standing at his forge in the deep middle of a sleeping village, whether it was still out there somewhere, still holding its edge, still carrying in its patterned steel the memory of his hands. The second Ulfberht he had made at 44, the third at 53. Each time the iron had been right, not just any iron, but the particular iron that made an Ulfberht what it was. The iron that came from far away, from traders who travelled routes so long and strange that the iron itself seemed to carry the memory of distant places in its grain. Each time the process had nearly broken him, not because the work was too much for his body, though it was very much for his body, but because the attention required was a kind of burning. You could not make an Ulfberht with part of your mind. You could not make an Ulfberht while worrying about the cattle, or the weather, or the politics between jarls. The blade required everything. It left you, at the end, emptied out, hollow in the way that a great exertion leaves you hollow, but also, beneath the exhaustion, strangely clean. He was 63 years old now. His left knee hurt in the cold. His vision, once so precise, now required him to hold things slightly farther from his eyes than he liked. He slept badly, and his back ached by mid-morning. He was, by any reasonable measure, an old man, and old men had no business attempting a 4th Ulfberht. He picked up his hammer. He was going to attempt a 4th Ulfberht. The iron in the fire was beginning to glow the first faint red of heat, taking hold, still to cool, not yet ready to be struck, but it would be. Halvard settled his weight onto both feet, feeling the familiar ache travel up from his knee through his hip, and he waited for the color to deepen. In the old Norse understanding of the smith's craft, there was a color for every temperature, a map of heat written in light, the first dark red that meant too soon, the brighter red that meant getting there, the orange that meant nearly bitty, and the yellow-white that was the hammer's true invitation. Every smith knew this map. The great smiths had memorized it so completely, they no longer thought about it. They simply saw the color, and their body responded, the way a musician hears a note, and his fingers move before his mind catches up. Halvard watched the iron. The iron glowed, the fire breathed. Outside, snow fell on Kelvik, soft and even and patient, covering the footprints and the animal tracks and the marks left by a day of living, as though the night were gently erasing the slate for the morning to begin again. And in the warm dark of a longhouse across the village, 3 children settled deeper into their furs as an old woman spoke in a low, steady voice about iron and fire, and the men who knew how to bring the two together into something that would last long after the men themselves were gone. The smallest child was already asleep, her breathing slow and even, a faint smile on her face as though the story had followed her down into her dreams and was making itself comfortable there. The hammer rang, the fire burned. The night held everything in its dark, cold hands, and Halvard Ironhand, 63 years old, with 1 thumb and a bad knee and 51 years of the truest knowledge, in the north, stored in his scarred and capable hands, began. Chapter 2. The Boy Who Listened to Metal. There is a particular kind of cold that comes before dawn in the deep of a Norse winter, not the sharp, biting cold of midnight, but something quieter and more complete, as though the world has breathed out everything that was left of the day's warmth and is now simply waiting, still and held, for the first grey light to give it permission to begin again. It is in this cold, in this particular nowhere hour, between the end of night and the start of morning, that the forge sounds loudest. The hammer's ring carries farther. The hiss of hot metal meeting cold air travels across snow as though the sound itself has edges. It was in this hour that Sigrun first came to the smithy. He was 11 years old, and he had not been sent. This was important. Halvard had apprentices in the formal sense, to older boys from the village, who came each morning when the light permitted, and left when their arms gave out, learning the basic grammar of the smith's trade, how to work the bellows without exhausting yourself, how to hold a piece properly with tongs so it didn't spin, how to strike with a hammer so the force went into the iron and not back up through your wrist into your elbow. Those boys were good enough. They would make serviceable smiths someday, the kind that every village needs and no one particularly notices. They would make nails and hooks and adequate knife blades, and they would be comfortable and competent and unremarkable. And there is nothing wrong with that. There is, in fact, great dignity in it. But Sigrun had not been sent by anyone. He had simply come. Halvard had been at the forge for 2 hours already, when the door of the smithy opened, and a small, thin figure stepped in from the cold, wrapped in an oversized wool cloak that had clearly belonged to someone considerably larger. The boy stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the space, the heat, the light, the smell that was unlike any other smell in the world. That particular combination of charcoal and hot iron, and the faint mineral ghost of steel, and the deeper, older smell beneath all of it, the smell of the earth itself being asked to give up something. Halvard watched him from under his brows without turning. He did not speak. He went on working. The boy did not speak either. He stepped inside, found a place against the wall that was not in the way of anything, and sat down on a low wooden stool that had been there so long it had become part of the floor. And then he did the thing that Halvard, even now, decades later in the telling, still considered to be one of the most extraordinary things he had ever seen a child do. He sat completely still. He folded his hands in his lap, and he watched, not the way children usually watch things, with fidgeting attention and the need to narrate what they're seeing aloud, but with the particular quality of attention that is usually reserved for people who have had some very good reason to learn how to listen carefully. The attention of someone who knows that the most important information is often the quietest. He watched for an hour without speaking. Halvard worked. The iron went in and out of the fire. The hammer rose and fell. Sparks scattered across the earth floor and died. Eventually, Halvard set his hammer down and turned to look at the boy fully for the first time. "You're Ragnar's youngest," he said. "Yes," said the boy. "Ragnar is a farmer." "Yes, what do you want?" The boy thought about this seriously, as though it were a question that deserved care. "I want to know what you hear," he said at last, "when the iron is right." Halvard looked at him for a long time. Then he went back to work without answering, but he did not tell the boy to leave. And the boy, understanding that this was its own kind of answer, settled back on his stool and went on watching. This was how it began. Sigrun came back the next morning, and the one after that, and the one after that. He never asked permission. He never announced himself. He simply appeared at the door of the smithy in the dark before dawn hours, sat on his stool, and watched with that extraordinary, unsettling stillness. The two formal apprentices, older boys named Ketil and Ormer, who came when the sun was properly up, found him vaguely alarming. There was something about a child who didn't fidget that made other children uncomfortable. The way a pond, with no ripples on it, seems somehow deeper than it is. But Halvard did not find him alarming. Halvard found him interesting, which was the word Halvard used for things that he wanted to look at more closely. On the 7th morning, without preamble or ceremony, he handed Sigrun a pair of tongs. "Hold this," he said, pressing the handle into the boy's hands. "Hold it the way I show you. Not too tight, you'll tire. Not too loose. You'll drop it, and we'll both regret that." Sigrun gripped the tongs. They were heavy, much heavier than he'd expected, and the iron they held was radiating heat that pressed against his face like a hand. He adjusted his grip, feeling for the balance, and something happened in his face, a small, focused shift, as though he had just heard a sound in the distance that he wanted to identify. Halvard saw it. He filed it away. "The tongs are an extension of your hands," he said, moving around the piece and positioning it over the anvil. "When you hold them right, you should forget they're there. When you feel them, when you're aware of the grip, something is wrong. The iron is telling you something. Maybe it's too hot and it's moving when you don't want it to. Maybe it's cooling and going stiff. Maybe you're fighting it instead of working with it. The tongs are a conversation, not a grip, a conversation," repeated Sigrun, as though testing the weight of the word. "Everything is a conversation," said Halvard. "Hammer to iron, iron to fire, fire to air, you to all of it." He raised his hammer. "Now, keep it steady." The hammer fell, and the iron rang. and Sigrun felt the vibration travel up through the tongs and into his hands and along his arms to somewhere in the center of his chest. And whatever expression had been on his face before was replaced by something simpler and more complete. The look of a person who has just found the thing they were made for. Over the weeks that followed, Halvard taught Sigrun in a way that the best teachers teach, not by explaining everything at once, but by placing the student in the presence of the thing itself and letting understanding arrive at its own speed. He taught him the bellows first, how to work them in a rhythm that fed the fire steadily rather than frantically, how to listen for the change in the fire's voice when the air was right, how to feel the heat from across the forge without being told to stop. He taught him how to read the color of iron as it heated, the whole quiet vocabulary of red and orange and yellow-white. That was the smith's most fundamental language, the thing that no book could ever have taught, even if books had been common, which they were not, because this knowledge lived in the body, not the mind, and could only be learned by being in the presence of fire for long enough that your eyes stopped seeing color the way ordinary eyes see it and began seeing temperature. He taught him the difference between iron and steel, which in those days was not the clean, well-defined difference that later centuries would know, but a more mysterious and intuitive thing, the understanding that some iron worked in certain ways under certain heats with certain amounts of charcoal pressed against it, and breathing into it became something harder and more willing to hold an edge. The Norse smiths of Halvard's time did not have the word carbon, did not know the chemistry behind what they were doing, but they knew that worked iron hardened differently depending on how you worked it and in what fire and for how long, and the great smiths among them had, through generations of careful attention, arrived at practices that produced results their chemistry could not yet explain. They knew what worked. They did not always know why. And this, Halvard told Sigrun, was not a failure of knowledge. It was a different kind of knowledge, the knowledge of hands and eyes and fire, which is older than words, and in many ways more reliable. "Does it bother you?" Sigrun asked one morning, watching Halvard heat a piece of bar iron for a simple hook that a farmer had commissioned, not knowing why the iron changes. Halvard considered this. He turned the iron in the fire. "Does it bother you?" he said, "not knowing why the sun rises?" "No, because it rises anyway." "Yes, then there's your answer." He drew the iron from the fire. "The iron changes because the iron changes. My job is to understand when and how and what to do with it. The why is a question for people with more time than I have." But even as he said it, Halvard knew this was only partly true. The why mattered. The why was precisely what he had been circling all his working life. Because there was one sword, one particular sword, one name inscribed in iron that no one in Keldvik spoke of lightly, that had forced the question of why into the center of his craft and kept it there, like a coal that never quite went out. The Ulfberht sword, the blade that was not like other blades, the blade whose why had occupied the finest smith minds of the Norse world for 2 centuries, and to which Halvard himself had devoted the best years of his particular, extraordinary life. He had not yet told Sigrun about it. Some things needed the ground prepared before the seed was put in. Some knowledge could only be received by a mind that had been made ready to hold it. But the morning was coming. He could feel it the way he felt the heat of the fire on his face, not as a thought exactly, but as a kind of readiness in the air between him and the boy, the particular quality of readiness that precedes important things. There is something that happens in a Norse smithy between a master and an apprentice who are properly matched, and this is a rare thing. As rare as the iron they were about to discuss, that does not have a name in any language that survives. It is not friendship, though it contains friendship. It is not the relationship between a father and a son, though it sometimes resembles it. It is something more specific, and in some ways more durable. The transmission of a particular way of being in the world, from one person to another, not through instruction alone but through proximity, through sharing the same fire and the same tools and the same long hours of attention and effort and occasional failure and occasional triumph. Halvard had experienced it once before. On the receiving end, when old Bjorn had stood at the forge beside him, and the knowledge had moved between them like heat moves through metal, not all at once but slowly, gradually, until one day Halvard had realized he could do a thing he could not do before, and the thing had no name and could not be pointed to, only felt. He had spent much of his working life understanding that this was the most valuable thing he had received, and wondering whether he would ever have occasion to pass it on. He looked at Sigrun, crouched by the fire with his small hands wrapped around the tong handles. his eyes on the glowing iron with that particular quality of attention that Halvard had recognized on the first morning and not stopped thinking about since. He was passing it on. He could feel it already, like the first vibration in the iron just before the hammer falls. The boy who listened to metal, the last apprentice, and the greatest thing either of them would ever make had not yet even been imagined. Chapter 3. The secret the river carried. The river that ran through Kelvik did not have a name that appears in any surviving record. In the village it was called simply the river, which was the kind of name that suffices when there is only one of something. In summer it was wide and fast and green-brown, carrying snowmelt down from the mountains with an urgency that could, in bad years, carry away bridges and low-lying storage huts and the occasional unwary animal. In winter it shrank into itself, growing slower and darker, its voice dropping from the summer's high, bright gabble to a lower, more secretive murmur, the sound of water moving under ice in the long middle of a cold season. It was along this river that the trader came. He arrived on a morning in late autumn, before the freeze had fully set in, when the ice along the banks was still just a skim, transparent and delicate, something a boot could punch through without thinking. He came in a small, flat-bottomed riverboat of a kind that was common among the Russ, the Norse settlers and traders who had pushed east along the great river systems of what is now Russia, following waterways from the Baltic Sea all the way south and east to Byzantium and beyond, routes so long and strange that a man who traveled them fully seemed, upon his return, to have visited a different world entirely, which in many ways he had. The trader's name was Leif Osterson, though he had lived so long among Eastern peoples that his Norse had acquired a particular cadence, slightly slower than the home country Norse, with occasional pauses where an Eastern word had replaced the Norse one so completely that the Norse one no longer came easily. He was a lean man, windark, with the particular self-containment of someone who has spent years being a stranger in unfamiliar places and has learned to carry himself as though this is simply the condition of the world. He traded in furs, amber, and occasionally in things that were harder to describe, things that came from the markets of Constantinople, from the workshops of craftsmen whose names no Norseman would ever know, whose techniques had been refined over centuries in places so far east that the very quality of light was different. He brought his boat to the bank just above the village, tied it to a stake he hammered into the frozen earth, and then spent a careful few minutes arranging cargo before he went to announce himself. Among the furs and amber and assorted goods in the bottom of the boat, wrapped in oiled cloth and then in a second layer of heavy waxed linen and packed into a wooden box that had been padded with wool, were 3 ingots of steel. Not iron, steel. The distinction matters, and it matters in a way that is worth understanding properly before we go further, because it is at the center of everything that follows. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the word iron was used broadly. It covered what we might today call wrought iron, which is iron with very little carbon content, relatively soft and workable, but prone to bending and difficult to sharpen to a lasting edge. It also covered what smiths called steel, which was iron with more carbon in it, harder, capable of holding an edge, but tricky to make and tricky to work with. The difficulty was control. Too little carbon, and you had soft iron. Too much, and you had a material so brittle it would shatter rather than bend. European smiths of the era had several methods for introducing carbon into iron, the most common being to work the iron for long periods in a charcoal fire, allowing carbon from the burning charcoal to slowly migrate into the surface of the metal, a process called carburization. This produced case-hardened iron, hard on the outside, softer within, useful but not ideal, and extremely difficult to do consistently. The Ulfberht sword required something different. It required steel of a quality and consistency that European carburization methods simply could not reliably produce. The carbon content needed to be distributed evenly through the entire piece, not just the surface, and it needed to be high enough to produce genuine hardness without tipping into brittleness. This was, in the metallurgical terms of the day, essentially impossible by conventional European methods, except that it wasn't impossible, because somewhere in the vast workshop of the world, someone had already figured out how to do it. That someone was in the East, in the workshops of craftsmen working in the tradition of what would later come to be known as Wootz steel, a method of producing steel in sealed crucibles at extremely high temperatures, a technique that resulted in a material of extraordinary purity and uniformity, with carbon distributed evenly throughout rather than concentrated at the surface. The resulting ingots were dense and fine-grained, and could be worked into objects of a quality that European methods simply could not match. These ingots reached the Norse world along the Volga trade routes, the same river roads that the Rus traveled between Scandinavia and Byzantium, the same roads that carried silk and spices and Byzantine gold in one direction, and furs and amber and slaves in the other. Crucible steel was not the most famous thing on these routes. It was not even the most valuable, measured in weight. But to a smith who knew what it was, who had held it, worked it, understood in his hands what it could become, it was worth more than gold. Because you could spend gold, and it was gone. But you could spend crucible steel in a forge fire, and what came out was something that lasted for 1,000 years. Halvard knew what it was. He had held it twice before. He had worked it twice before, on the second and third of his Ulfberht swords. And when Leif Osterson knocked on the door of the smithy and said, without preamble, "The way traders who respect their customers do not waste time, I have 3 ingots. Crucible, steel. I came here first." Halvard had simply looked at him for a long moment, and then stepped aside to let him in. They sat across from each other near the forge, Leif on the low stool that was usually Sigrun's, Halvard on his own seat. The 3 ingots between them on the earthen floor, wrapped in their oiled cloth. The fire breathed in the background. Neither man spoke for a moment. This was not rudeness. It was the particular silence of men who had dealt with each other before, or with men like each other, and have no need to fill the air with words that serve no purpose. "Long way to come," said Halvard at last. "Long way to come for many things," said Leif. "Some things are worth it." Halvard picked up one of the ingots, still wrapped, not yet unwrapped, feeling its weight through the cloth. It was heavier than wrought iron, of the same size, denser. Even through the oiled linen he could feel that particular solidity that was different from ordinary iron, the way that certain words are different from other words, not louder, exactly, but more present. He set it down carefully. "What do you want for them?" Leif named a price in silver that was very high and entirely fair. Halvard looked at the ingots for a while longer. Then he nodded once, and that was that. The silver would come from the reserve he kept buried beneath the floor, in the southwest corner of the smithy, under a stone that no one but he and his dead wife had ever known the location of. It would leave him with very little reserve. He did not particularly mind. A man of 63 with a bad knee and one thumb had limited use for silver reserves. He had, on the other hand, a very specific use for crucible steel. "One question," said Halvard. "Ask, where did these come from? Not the root, the origin, the maker." Leif considered this. He was not a man who gave information freely, but neither was he a man who withheld it without reason, and in this case he had no reason. "The same workshops as before," he said. "I don't know the men's names. Nobody does. On this end, they work in the tradition of the old Eastern methods. The temperature they reach." He shook his head slightly. "I've seen the furnaces. They're like nothing we build here. They go higher, much higher, and the steel comes out clean." Halvard nodded slowly. "Clean," he repeated, half to himself. "Clean," confirmed Leif. That word, clean, it was the word that explained everything, if you had the ears to hear it. Clean steel. Steel with the impurities burned out, with the slag that ordinarily weakened iron removed by the heat of the crucible, with carbon distributed evenly and honestly throughout. Clean was what ordinary iron was not. Clean was what an Ulfberht needed to be. And clean, in a world where most iron was processed from bog or in clay-lined furnaces that could not reach the temperatures needed to truly purify it, was extraordinarily, almost impossibly rare. After Leif had gone, Halvard sat for a long time alone in the smithy with the 3 ingots beside him. Not working, not speaking, just sitting in the firelight with the particular quality of stillness that he shared. It turned out, with his apprentice, a stillness that was not absence of thought but its opposite. Thought so dense and focused that no room remained for the fidgeting and drifting that distracted people filled their silences with. He was deciding, not whether to make the sword. That had already been decided. In the moment, Leif had said crucible steel at his door. The deciding was something larger and harder. Whether he was equal to this. At 63, with everything that 63 meant, the slower hands, the eye that needed more light, the back that spoke to him all morning and most of the afternoon, was he still the man who could take this iron and make it what it needed to become? Was the knowledge still alive in him, in the way it needed to be alive, not just recalled but felt, in the hands, in the body, in that deep wordless place where the truly important knowledge lives? He pressed his scarred right hand flat against the oiled cloth of an ingot, felt the dense, clean weight of it. Yes, he thought. Not with arrogance, not with certainty either, but yes. He unwrapped the first ingot and set it in the firelight. It was dark and fine-grained, denser than normal iron, its surface showing faint patterning, the way that water shows faint patterning when wind moves across it, the signature of the crucible process, of steel that had been made at a temperature where iron becomes something approaching liquid and the impurities float away and what remains is only what ought to remain. He looked at it for a long time. In the morning he would call Sigrun and he would begin to tell the boy what this was. He would tell him what it required. He would tell him what they were going to do with it. But for now he sat alone, and the fire breathed. And outside the river moved under its skim of ice, with the low, private murmur of water that knows where it is going and has all the time in the world to get there. There is a moment, known to anyone who has ever undertaken something they knew would ask everything of them, when the undertaking becomes real, when it crosses from the territory of intention into the territory of fact, from something you might do into something you are doing. This moment rarely announces itself dramatically. It does not arrive with thunder or vision. It arrives quietly, sideways, in the form of a small and ordinary action. A hand laid on a surface, a decision nodded at, a fire banked up for the night. Halvard banked his fire. He covered the ingots in their cloth. He stood at the door of the smithy for a moment and looked at the village sleeping under its new snow, at the dark ridge of pine against the blue dark sky, at the stars that were beginning to show through a break in the cloud, moving in from the west. Right then, he said softly, to himself, to the night, to the iron cooling behind him, and he went inside, and the smithy door closed, and the snow fell quietly over Keldvik, and the river moved beneath its ice, and somewhere deep in the oiled cloth beside the forge, 3 ingots of crucible steel waited with all the patience of something that has already been through fire and knows it can survive what comes next. Chapter 4. Iron Ore and the Language of Fire. The morning after the trader came, Halvard rose before light, as he always did, and went to the smithy and built the fire up from the banked coals, and stood watching it strengthen. And when it was burning cleanly with that steady, non-frantic heat that meant it was ready for work, he walked to the door and opened it, and looked out across the grey early morning of the village, and waited. He did not have to wait long. Sigrun appeared from the direction of his father's longhouse in the uncertain pre-dawn light, wrapped in the large wool cloak, moving quickly across the frozen ground with the particular purposefulness of someone who has somewhere they actually want to be. Halvard watched him come, watched the boy's eyes find the open door of the smithy and move there like iron filings to a lodestone. "Come in," said Halvard, stepping back. "Sit down. Today I'm going to talk. You're going to listen." Sigrun sat on his stool. He folded his hands. He did the thing he did with his attention, gathered it in, turned it up, made of himself a single instrument of reception. Halvard stood at the forge with the 3 ingots, unwrapped now on the stone beside him. 3 dark, dense blocks of crucible steel that caught the firelight in a way slightly different from the ordinary iron bars stacked against the wall, as though their density gave the light something more to hold on to. "I'm going to tell you about iron," said Halvard. He did not sit down. When he taught, he stood, not for authority's sake, but because standing allowed him to move, to point, to demonstrate with his hands and body, which was always where his truest explanation lived. "I'm going to tell you about what it is, and where it comes from, and what the difference is between iron that is good enough, and iron that is what it needs to be. And then I'm going to tell you about what those are." He nodded at the ingots. "And then you'll understand what we're going to spend the next several months of our lives doing." Sigrun looked at the ingots, then back at Halvard. "All right," he said. "Iron begins in the earth. This is not a poetic observation, it is a physical one. Iron is one of the most common elements in the ground beneath our feet, and for most of human history, the version that people could most easily access was bog iron, nodules and lumps of iron ore that formed in peat bogs and shallow lakes and marshes, deposited there by the slow chemistry of water moving through iron-rich soil. Bog iron was everywhere in Scandinavia. Every village within walking distance of a suitable bog had access to it. It was the iron of everyday life, the iron of hooks and hinges and simple tools, and the majority of knives and axes and swords that ordinary Norse people carried and used. But bog iron had a problem. It had many problems actually, but they all came from the same root, impurity. Bog iron ore, before it is processed, is full of things that are not iron. Silicates, phosphorus, sulfur, carbon in inconsistent amounts, and various other mineral companions that have been caught up in the iron's slow accumulation in the earth. To use the iron, you have to get rid of these things, or most of them, and the way you do that is by heating the ore in a furnace called a bloomery, hot enough to melt the impurities into a glassy substance called slag, while the iron itself begins to consolidate into a spongy mass called a bloom. Halvard had a piece of bloom iron on the bench. He held it up so the fire caught it. It was roughly the size of a fist, greyish, pitted, looking less like a piece of metal than like a piece of old sponge that happened to be very heavy. This, he said to Sigrun, is where most iron starts. After the ore comes out of the bloomery, you see the texture, all those pores and cavities. Some of those are slag that didn't fully separate. Some are air pockets. All of it is weakness. When a smith takes this and begins to work it, hammers it, heats it, hammers it again, he's trying to collapse those pockets, drive out the slag, consolidate the iron into something solid and reliable. Does it work? Said Sigrun. Well enough, said Halvard. Mostly, you can make a serviceable axe from this. You can make a knife that will hold an edge for a reasonable time. You can make a sword that will serve a warrior through many battles if he is careful with it. But the key word is careful, because what remains in the iron, the slag that didn't come out, the impurities that got trapped, those are the points of weakness. In cold weather, the iron becomes more brittle. Under hard use, a blade with slag inclusions may crack at the inclusion. The blade bends when it should spring. The edge chips when it should hold. He set the bloom iron down. Good enough is not the same as good. Sigrun was watching the bloom iron with that narrowed, focused gaze. So every sword in the village has these weaknesses. Every sword made from bog iron in a standard bloomery, which is to say, every sword in this village, and most swords in most villages within a very long walk of here. He paused, except one kind. He picked up one of the crucible steel ingots. Even the way he picked it up was different, more careful, more deliberate. The way you handle something you understand the value of. He held it in both hands and turned it in the firelight, and the fire did that thing with it, held the light differently, and Sigrun's eyes moved to it and stayed there. This, said Halvard, is not bog iron. This did not come from a bloomery. This came from a place far to the east, from craftsmen working in a tradition so old and so refined that what they produce is a different substance, altogether from what comes out of any furnace in this part of the world. He set the ingot on the anvil. Do you see how it looks different? Denser, said Sigrun immediately. And the surface, there's a pattern. Like water. Halvard looked at him sharply. You can see that? Yes, it's faint, but it's there. Halvard said nothing for a moment. Most people could not see the patterning in crucible steel without it being pointed out. Most smiths had to have it explained to them. Sigrun had seen it without being asked to look. He filed this away carefully, with the other things he was filing. The pattern comes from the process, he said. The craftsmen in the east, far east, past where any of us have been, they make steel in sealed clay pots, called crucibles. They heat them to temperatures that we cannot reach in a standard furnace, temperatures so high that the iron becomes liquid. At that temperature the impurities float to the top and can be removed, and the carbon which gives iron its hardness can be introduced into the melt and distributed evenly through the entire piece, not just the surface. When it cools, the result is steel of a purity and consistency that our methods cannot approach. He tapped the ingot. What's in your hands here is not iron with some carbon in the outside. It is steel all the way through, clean, consistent, with no slag inclusions and no points of weakness. Sigrun reached out and touched the ingot, ran his fingertips along its surface. And this is what the Ulfberht sword is made from, he said. It was not a question. Halvard looked at him. How do you know that name? Everyone knows that name, said Sigrun. I've heard it. Warriors talk about it. My father talked about it. They say it's a sword that doesn't break, that holds its edge longer than anything else, that a man who carries one has an advantage over everyone else in the field. He looked up. They say only a few exist, that most of the ones people call Ulfberht are fakes. That's right, said Halvard. Most of the ones you'll see with that name on them, the inscription, the letters, were made by smiths who copied the name but not the iron. They made the blade from ordinary iron, put the name on it, sold it to men who wanted to believe they had something they didn't have. His voice carried no particular judgment. This was simply the world as it was. A fake Ulfberht looks like the real one, from a distance. But pick it up and work it, and it tells you immediately what it is. And in a battle it tells you again, in a way that you cannot recover from. "And the real one," said Sigrun. "The real one is made from this iron," said Halvard, putting his hand flat on the ingot. "Worked in the right way, at the right heat, for the right amount of time, by hands that understand what they're asking of it. And then it is given the name, not as a mark of ownership, but as a declaration of truth. The name says, this is what it is. Nothing is hidden. The blade is what the name says it is." He turned back to the fire, stood looking at it for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, not softer exactly, but more inward, as though he was speaking to the fire as much as to the boy. "We are going to make a real one," he said. "You and I together. It will take months. It will ask everything we have, and then ask for more. There will be days when you think it cannot be done, and I will tell you that it can. There may be a day when I think it cannot be done, and on that day I will need you to say nothing and simply keep the fire going." He turned to look at Sigrun. "Can you do that?" Sigrun met his eyes. "Yes," he said. Outside, the light had come fully up over the ridge. The village was waking. In the distance, cattle lowed and someone called a name across the frost. The world of ordinary morning was reasserting itself around the smithy, the way the ordinary world always reasserts itself, patient and indifferent to whatever extraordinary thing is being undertaken inside the small, warm spaces where extraordinary things happen. But inside, the fire burned. The crucible steel sat on the anvil, dense and patient, and already waiting. And a 63-year-old smith with one thumb, and a young boy with eyes that could see. Things without being told to look had begun. In the only way great things are ever begun, with a conversation and a decision and a fire built up to the right heat. The language of fire, the grammar of iron, the long, slow, magnificent sentence they were about to forge together. Chapter 5. The first fold, layers upon layers. There is a sound that a forge makes when the work is truly serious. When the smith is not making hooks or hinges or any of the ordinary necessary things that keep a village alive, but something that requires the forge's full attention and his own. And this sound is different from the potent sound of ordinary smithing. The way that a river in full flood is different from the same river in a dry summer. The rhythm changes. The intervals between strikes are longer, more deliberate. The silence between hammer and hammer becomes as important as the strike itself. And in that silence you can hear the fire breathe, and the metals settle, and something else beneath those sounds that has no name but is understood by anyone who has ever stood at an anvil and asked more of themselves than they thought they had. This was the sound that Keldvik woke to on the morning that Halvard and Sigrun began the pattern welding. It was, by Halvard's careful reckoning, the right day for it. He had spent several days before it in a form of preparation that would have looked, to an outside eye, like idleness. He sat with the iron. He heated small test pieces and watched how they moved. He studied the crucible steel ingots the way a man studies a text he is about to translate, not skimming, but reading each line slowly, asking what it wanted to say. He spoke to Sigrun about the process in general terms, broad strokes, the shape of what they were going to do. And he waited for a morning when the temperature in the smithy was cold enough to make the color of hot iron visible against it, because a warm smithy in summer light washed out the crucial color differences, and they needed to see every shade clearly, needed to read the metal's temperature in its light, the way a navigator reads the stars. The morning came, hard frost on the ground, a sky of pale gray promising neither storm nor sun, the perfect neutral light of a true workday. Halvard built the forge fire to a heat that most smiths did not attempt, higher than was needed for ordinary work, higher than was comfortable, fed by charcoal packed and arranged in a specific way to produce a consistent column of heat rather than a variable one. The fire was not frantic, it was committed. There is a difference. He took the first of his iron rods, ordinary wrought iron, prepared in advance from the best bloom iron he had, worked clean over many heats, and the first section of crucible steel, a piece roughly as long as his hand, and he placed them both in the fire together, side by side. And then he stepped back, and he looked at Sigrun, and he said, "We are going to make them into one thing." Pattern welding is among the most demanding techniques in the entire vocabulary of the blacksmith's craft. It is, at its simplest, the process of taking multiple pieces of iron or steel with different properties and forge welding them together, heating them until they are at the precise temperature where the surfaces will fuse if struck correctly, then hammering them together in such a way that they bond at the molecular level, becoming not two things pressed against each other, but a single new thing with the properties of both. Done well, it produces a material that is tougher than either of its components alone. the hard crucible steel reinforced by the flexible wrought iron, the softness of the iron corrected by the carbon richness of the steel, the whole more capable than its parts because of the way the parts have been united. Done badly, it produces nothing but ruined iron and wasted days. The moment of forge welding, the temperature at which the bond becomes possible, is described in every tradition that has practiced it as a near impossible thing to judge. To cool, and the surfaces will not bond, no matter how hard you strike. You will simply batter them against each other uselessly. The strike ringing back into your arms without that particular deep, soft sound that means the metal has accepted the blow. Too hot, and the iron passes through the welding temperature into the territory of burning, oxidizing at the surface, crumbling, ruined. The window is narrow. It is measured not in any unit we would recognize, but in color, the yellow-white brightness that means welding heat, arrived at and departing quickly, existing for perhaps 30 seconds before the metal begins to cool away from it. Halvard had judged this color 2,000 times in his working life. He knew it the way he knew his own heartbeat, not by thinking about it, but by the felt certainty of recognition. And even for him, even now, when the iron came out of the fire and the color was right, there was always a fraction of a second of doubt, that tiny hesitation of the mind that asks, "Are you sure?" before the body, which knows, has already begun to move. He drew both pieces from the fire. The light they gave off was almost painful, a yellow-white that was its own source of illumination, throwing the smithy into sharp relief, putting Halvard's shadow long and dark against the wall behind him. He moved without hesitation, setting them on the anvil face to face, and reached for his hammer. "Stay back," he said to Sigrun, not roughly, just stating a fact. "Watch, don't speak." And then the hammer fell. The first strike of a forge weld is unlike any other strike in smithing. It must be precise in its placement. The two pieces need to be driven together squarely, without sliding or twisting, and it must be fully committed, because a hesitant strike at welding heat achieves nothing, and a timid smith is a wasted fire. But it must also be controlled, because the metal at welding heat is soft in a way that approaches liquid, and a blow that is too heavy in the wrong place will distort the shape beyond recovery. Halvard's hammer fell with that particular quality of authority that comes from complete understanding of what is needed, not force alone but informed force, the strike of a man who has built the blow in his mind before it arrives in his arm. The two pieces sang against each other, a sound lower and softer than an ordinary hammer strike, the sound of metal accepting metal. He struck again, moving in a pattern across the surface of the joined pieces, spreading the weld, encouraging the two different irons to become one. The heat was dropping with every second, the yellow-white cooling toward orange, and he was watching the color with the part of him that never entirely stopped watching, even while the rest of him was working. 3 more strikes, the pieces were together. He thrust them back into the fire. He breathed. "Did it take?" said Sigrun. "Quiet. We'll see," said Halvard. "Next heat will tell us." They waited. The fire breathed. The joined piece in the fire went from dark to red to orange, climbing back toward the working temperature. Halvard watched it with narrowed eyes, seeing past the outer surface into the behavior of the piece, the way it moved as it heated, the way it held its shape. A bad weld would show at this point, the pieces beginning to separate. A visible seam opening as the expansion of heating revealed what the hammering had not fully joined. A good weld would show nothing. The two would move as one. Nothing. The piece was one. "Good," said Halvard quietly, with no particular drama. "Now we work it out." The working out, the process of drawing the welded billet into a usable shape through repeated heating and hammering, is where the pattern welding earns its name. As Halvard and Sigrun worked the combined iron and steel through cycle after cycle of heat and hammer, something began to happen to the surface of the metal. Patterns emerged, not stamped on from outside, not applied as decoration, but arising from within the material itself, from the different ways that the iron and the steel responded to the same hammer blows, from the twisting and folding that redistributed the layers and changed their relationship to the surface. The wrought iron and the crucible steel had different grain structures, different densities, and when they were twisted together, literally taken in tongs and rotated, then hammered flat, those different structures showed themselves on the surface as flowing lines, as wave-like curves, as the particular organic patterning that 1,000 years later would make these blades famous in museums and collectors' cases. The pattern that people would call by various names, but that was always, simply, the visible record of the blade's making. Halvard showed Sigrun how to twist. This required 2 people, one to hold the piece in tongs while it was still at heat, the other to apply a second pair of tongs and rotate, the 2 of them working in precise synchrony, the piece between them like an argument being resolved between 2 reasonable parties. The twisting had to be done quickly, before the heat dropped, and it had to be done evenly, so that the pattern developed consistently, rather than clustering in one area and leaving another plane. "Feel the resistance," Halvard said, his voice straining slightly with the effort of holding his side. "The metal is telling you how much twist it will take. Don't fight it. Go with its willing and stop before it's unwilling." Sigrun, face red from the heat and concentration, his arms shaking slightly from the effort of holding the tongs at that temperature, turned his piece steadily. His jaw was set. His eyes were on the metal, reading it with that quality of attention that was already becoming, in Halvard's estimation, one of the finest things the boy had. The twist went in cleanly. They laid the piece back on the anvil and hammered it flat. The pattern rushed to the surface like something that had been waiting for permission to appear, sinuous and flowing. Neither geometric nor random, but something between the two. The way the pattern of wind on water is neither regular nor chaotic. Halvard and Sigrun looked at it in silence for a moment. "It's beautiful," said Sigrun, and the word came out slightly surprised, as though he had not expected to say it. "It is," said Halvard, "but that's not why we're doing it. The beauty is the evidence. It tells you that the layers are where they should be, that the weld has taken, that the 2 metals are properly mixed. If the pattern isn't there, or if it's irregular, something has gone wrong with the welding. The pattern is the record of what happened. It's the blade telling you its own history." He paused. "Remember that. A blade that hides what it is a blade that cannot be trusted. The Ulfberht shows you everything." They went back to work. The fire was built up again. The piece went back in. Another heat, another drawing out, the billet lengthening slowly under the hammer, finding its shape the way all things find their shapes, not suddenly, but gradually, through accumulated effort. Each blow building on the last, each heat adding to the previous one, the whole greater than any single act. Sigrun worked in silence, learning the rhythm. The rhythm of it was the thing that surprised him most. He had expected the forge to feel urgent, dramatic, full of decisive moments. And there were decisive moments, but they were embedded in long stretches of patient, repetitive work. The steady cycling of heat and hammer and rest and heat again, that were less like a dramatic event and more like breathing. You did not think about each breath. You found the rhythm and you stayed in it, and the work happened inside the rhythm the way music happens inside time. By midday they had the first section of the billet drawn out and ready for folding. By mid-afternoon the first fold was done. The billet doubled back on itself and re-did. The layers inside it doubling from 1 to 2 to 4, each fold multiplying the complexity of the pattern waiting inside, storing it there for the final surface work that would reveal it. Halvard showed Sigrun how to count folds in his head, how to keep track of where they were in the process, because losing track of the folds was like losing track of the chapters in a story. You could not know where you were going if you did not know where you had been. By the time the fire began to dim toward evening, and the light through the smoke hole had turned the color of old copper, they had done 4 folds, and the billet was singing. That was the only word for it. The sound it made when it was right, a particular clarity and resonance to the hammer strikes that told an experienced ear that the metal was healthy, that the welds were good, that the layers had taken and were doing what they were supposed to do. Halvard set his hammer down, rolled his right shoulder. It ached, as it always did, after a long forge session. Looked at the billet cooling on the hearth. Looked at Sigrun, who was sitting on his stool, with his arms hanging loose between his knees, exhausted in the frank and total way that only honest physical work produces. Not depleted, but emptied out in a good way. Scoured clean. 4 folds today, said Halvard. We need 16, minimum, for the core, maybe more. How many days? As many as it takes. Sigrun nodded. Outside, the village was settling into evening fires, being built up, animals being brought in, the sounds of day winding toward the sounds of night. Somewhere across the village, Sigrun's mother would be wondering where her son was. He would go home soon. He would eat and sleep, and in the morning he would be back on his stool before the rest of the village was awake. Halvard, he said, as he was putting on his cloak. Yes, each fold doubles the layers. Yes, and the pattern in the iron, the one we saw today, that's all those layers, visible on the surface. Yes. Sigrun paused at the door, thinking. His breath made a small cloud in the cold air coming in from outside. So when someone looks at the pattern, he said slowly, they're looking at the whole history of the making. Every fold, every heat, every choice. Halvard looked at him for a moment. Yes, he said quietly. That's exactly right. The boy nodded once, satisfied, as though he had confirmed something he had suspected since morning. Then he went out into the cold evening and headed home, crunching across the frost toward his father's longhouse, while behind him the smithy fire dimmed to a slow pulse in the dark, and the billet cooling on the hearth carried inside it, in its layers, the first 4 chapters of a story that still had a long way to go. Chapter 6. What the Warriors Knew. There are nights in the Norse winter that seem to exist outside of time, nights when the cold is so complete and the dark so total, and the stars so numerous and still that the ordinary passage of hours seems to pause, and the world holds its breath. And if you are awake in such a night, inside a warm space with firelight on your face, you feel the strange doubling sensation of being very present and very far away at once. Present in the warmth, and in the fire, and in your own body, and far away in the dark and the stars, and the long run of time. It was on such a night, perhaps 3 weeks into the forging, that Halvard told Sigrun about the warriors. The boy had been coming to the smithy every morning before dawn, and they had been working through the long days until the light failed, or their bodies refused further effort, whichever came first. The billet had progressed slowly, with the careful deliberateness that Halvard imposed on every stage, checking and re-checking, sometimes setting the work aside for a full day, because his eye told him something was not right, and he needed time to understand what through fold after fold, the layers multiplying, the core of the future blade taking shape. Sigrun's hands were hardening, his arms were stronger than they had been. He had stopped burning himself on the work, not because the work had become less hot, but because his body had learned a new set of reflexes, the instinctive pullback and reposition that experienced smiths perform without thinking. On this particular night, a late snowfall had come in from the west and closed the world down to the small circle of the smithy's warmth. There was no point in working, the light was wrong, and Halvard's right shoulder had spoken to him with unusual insistence all afternoon, the way it did when it needed a rest. So instead of working they sat. Halvard had a skin of mead, not much, just enough to put warmth in the joints, and he poured a small cup for Sigrun, which the boy accepted with a gravity that made Halvard almost smile. They sat on opposite sides of the forge, the banked fire between them, and for a while neither spoke. Then Halvard said, "I'm going to tell you about a man named Gunnar." Gunnar brought axe, though by the time of the story the axe had been set aside in favor of the sword, was a warrior who had lived 3 generations before Halvard's time, which placed him in the earlier part of the 9th century, in the age of the Great Western Raiding and the longship voyages that had taken Norse warriors as far as Ireland and Francia and the coasts of what would one day be England. Halvard had not known him personally. Of course, Gunnar had been dead for 100 years and more by the time Halvard was born, but he had heard the account from his own master Bjorn, who had heard it from his master, who had been told it by a man who claimed to have been present, which was either true or the kind of elaboration that attaches itself to good stories and becomes, after enough retellings, as true as the rest. Gunnar had carried an Ulfberht sword. He had come by it through a transaction, the details of which were not recorded, as such details often were not, a purchase, perhaps, or a gift from a jarl, or the prize of some earlier engagement. What was recorded, what Bjorn had passed to Halvard, with the particular emphasis reserved for things that mattered, was what happened at a river crossing in the east, not the Volga, not so far as that, but a river further west, in the territory of the Franks, in a winter so cold that the river had frozen over, except for a channel in the center where the current ran too fast for ice to form. A force of Norse warriors had been attempting to cross this river. Their path took them along the frozen bank, and then across a narrow section where 2 wooden bridges had been built, one after the other, to span the worst of the water. They were being contested. Soldiers of the Frankish lord, whose territory this was, had moved to hold the bridges, knowing that the river was the natural defense and the bridges were its only weakness. The fighting at the first bridge was bad, close and brutal, the kind of fighting where swords were used short and dirty, not the clean wide strokes of songs and stories, but the desperate close work of men trying to kill each other in a space too narrow to swing properly. In this fighting, something began to happen to the swords. The temperature was extreme, not the grey cold of a mild winter, but the deep, killing cold of a river valley, in a year when the frost had come early and stayed. And in this cold, iron behaved differently than it did in a workshop or a summer battlefield. The bog iron swords, good enough swords, serviceable swords, swords that had done their work adequately in a dozen previous engagements, began to fail. Not all at once. Gradually, a blade would chip at the edge where it met another blade. A point would break off under a hard thrust against a shield boss. A sword swung hard against a helmet would ring wrong and show a hairline crack at the point of impact, and the warrior who held it would feel the wrongness travel back through the grip and would know, without words, that the blade was not long for this world. The slag inclusions that bog iron always carried, those microscopic pockets of impurity distributed through the metal, behaved differently in extreme cold. In warmer conditions they were almost inert, their effect on the blade's performance subtle and gradual. But in deep cold, metal contracts, and as it contracts, the differences in contraction rates between pure iron and the slag inclusions created internal stresses. The blade became brittle at those points. A shock that would have been absorbed and dispersed in normal conditions instead cracked through the metal at its weakest places. Good enough became not enough. Very quickly, in a fight on a frozen river in a Frankish winter, Gunnar's sword did not crack. Gunnar's sword did not chip. Gunnar held the near bank of the first bridge, as his companions' swords failed one by one around him, not because he was a better fighter than the men beside him, or because the gods particularly loved him, but because his blade continued to do what a blade is supposed to do, in conditions that had broken every other blade in that crossing. The crucible steel in the Ulfberht had no slag inclusions to contract against themselves. The carbon was distributed evenly through the metal, not concentrated at the surface. The grain was fine and clean, and gave the cold no foothold for its particular destructiveness. The blade remained exactly what it had always been, because it had been made to be exactly what it was, in all conditions, without compromise. How long Gunnar held the bridge alone, or nearly alone, before his companions regrouped with replacement weapons, was a matter of some variation between the tellings. Halvard told Sigrun that he had learned to distrust specific numbers in stories like this. They had a way of growing with the retellings, 5 becoming 10, 10 becoming 20. What he believed, what Bjorn had emphasized as the essential truth of the account, was simpler and more important than the numbers, that the difference between a true Ulfberht and any other sword was not primarily aesthetic, not primarily a matter of sharpness, or weight, or balance, or any of the qualities that warriors spoke of when they were speaking of preference. It was a matter of reliability under conditions that stripped away everything that was merely adequate and left only what was truly sound. "The sword doesn't make a warrior," said Halvard, after he had finished the account and let the silence sit for a moment. He was looking at the fire. "A poor warrior with a great sword loses as often as he would with any other. The sword doesn't think. It doesn't choose. It doesn't compensate for bad decisions, or poor tactics, or failure of courage." He turned the mead cup in his hands. "But a great warrior with a great sword, there, the sword matters. Because a great warrior already has everything else. He has the skill and the nerve and the tactical mind. All he needs from the sword is that it not fail him, that it be what it says it is, and go on being that, in the cold, and the heat, and the chaos, and the dark." He paused. "A forge lyre is the worst thing a sword can be, a blade that presents well and fails under test. The warrior who carries it does not know what he has until he needs it most, and then he finds out at the worst possible moment." Sigrun was looking at the banked fire. "And the Ulfberht doesn't lie," he said. "Cannot lie," said Halvard. "It's not a matter of choice. You cannot deceive with a material that has no weaknesses to hide. The crucible steel is clean all the way through. There is no inside different from the outside. What you see is what the sword is." He poured a little more mead into his cup and was quiet for a while. And in the quiet, the fire breathed and the snow fell against the walls of the smithy with a sound like the turning of pages in a very old book. "Halvard," said Sigrun. "Yes, the Ulfberht that exists now, the ones that warriors have, when they are gone, when those swords are lost or buried or broken. There will be no more unless someone keeps making them." He paused. "Is that why you're making this one?" Halvard looked at him across the fire. The boy's face in the firelight was serious and older than 11. The way children's faces sometimes are when they have just understood something that they cannot fully articulate but know to be important. "That is part of it," said Halvard. "What is the other part?" A long pause. The fire breathed. Outside the snow was easing, the wind dropping, the world becoming quieter by degrees. "Because I know how," said Halvard finally. "And as long as I know how, and can still hold a hammer, and have the iron, It would be a kind of dishonesty not to. He set his cup down. Some knowledge is not ours to keep to ourselves. It belongs to whoever needs it most. The warrior who will carry this blade has not commissioned it yet, may not know it is coming. But somewhere there is a person for whom this blade will matter in the way Gunnar's mattered to him, and the way each of the others mattered to whoever carried them. My job is to make it true. Their job is to be equal to it. Sigrun sat with this for a while. The fire settled. The snow had stopped entirely now, and the night had gone very quiet. The particular quality of quiet that follows snowfall, as though the world had been muffled in something soft and patient. "We should sleep," said Halvard. "Tomorrow the shoulder will be better, and we can go back to the core." He banked the fire. Sigrun pulled on his cloak. They stood for a moment in the doorway of the smithy, side by side, looking out at a world that was entirely white and entirely still. The new snow covering everything so that Keldvik looked, in the dark, like a village made of thought rather than wood and earth. Clean, potential, waiting to be inhabited again by morning. "Halvard," said Sigrun. "What? Gunnar? Did he survive the crossing?" Halvard stepped back inside, began to close the door. "He survived 20 more years," he said, "died in his bed. The sword outlasted him." He closed the door. It always does. The latch fell. The fire inside breathed in the dark, low and patient and constant. Outside, the white world held its silence, and the stars, those scattered forge embers in the darkness overhead, burned on with the particular steadiness of things that have been burning for a very long time and have no intention of stopping. The billet waited in the smithy. The knowledge was being passed. The work was not finished. It was nowhere near finished. But in the long, good darkness of a winter night, with the whole of the village sleeping and the fire keeping its quiet faith, everything that needed to be there was there, and everything that needed to happen next was simply waiting for morning. "Sleep now, little one. The forge remembers, and morning is not far away." Chapter 7. The crisis of the core. There is a particular silence that a smithy produces when something has gone wrong. Not the comfortable silence of concentrated work, not the resting silence between heats, but a silence with a different quality entirely. A silence that has weight and texture, that sits in the room the way a stone sits in still water, heavy and unmistakable. Anyone who has spent enough time in a forge knows this silence the moment it arrives. It is the silence of a man standing at his anvil, not moving, not speaking, looking at something he does not want to be looking at. Sigrun knew it before he fully understood what he was seeing. He had come in that morning as he always did, before light, before the village had begun to stir. And Halvard had already been at the forge for an hour, which was unusual, because in the weeks of their working together, a rhythm had established itself. Halvard arriving first, but only just, the two of them beginning together as the darkness was thinning. The fire was built up to full working heat, which was also unusual for this early, before the cold had fully lifted from the stone and the bellows work had properly warmed the space. Halvard was standing at the anvil with his arms at his sides and his head slightly bowed, and the billet, the core section they had been developing for 6 weeks, through 16 careful folds, through heat upon patient heat, through days when it went well, and days when it was merely satisfactory, and one magnificent day when everything was exactly right, and the pattern that emerged from the metal was so clean and precise and flowing that Halvard had stood and looked at it for a full minute without speaking, which was his version of joy. The billet was on the anvil in front of him, and Halvard was looking at it with the expression of a man who has received very bad news, in a language he understands too well to pretend he does not. Sigrun set down his cloak and crossed the smithy and stood beside the master and looked at what Halvard was looking at. There was a line in the billet, faint but present, running along the upper third of the piece, not at the surface but visible from a certain angle in the firelight. A slight discontinuity in the pattern, a place where the flowing lines that should have been continuous and smooth had been interrupted, where the two sides of the pattern no longer matched, where something in the interior of the metal had failed to become the single unified thing that all the weeks of work had been building toward. A cold shut. The cold shut is the forge welder's particular nightmare. It happens when two surfaces that have been brought together for welding have lost enough heat before the hammer strikes to prevent a true bond from forming, when the temperature has dropped just below the welding point. Not enough for the metal to show it in its color. Not enough for even an experienced eye to catch with certainty, but enough for the bond at that location to be imperfect. The metal closes around the cold spot, shuts over it, hence the name, and from the outside it can look perfectly fine. The surface shows no seam. The piece continues to work normally, heats and hammers as it should, behaves in every observable way like sound metal, until you look at it from exactly the right angle, in exactly the right light, and see the interruption in the grain. The ghost of a plane where the two surfaces that should have become one have instead remained at that spot, too. And then you must decide what to do with this knowledge. The decision is not simple. A cold shut in an ordinary piece, a hook, a hinge, an agricultural tool might be left. The piece might serve its purpose for years without the flaw ever becoming a problem. The forces on it might never concentrate at exactly that point, in exactly the way that would reveal the weakness. It might be perfectly adequate, but a cold shut in an Ulfberht sword is not something that can be left. The entire meaning of the Ulfberht, the reason warriors paid the price they paid, the reason the name carried the weight it carried, the reason Halvard had spent 51 years of his life in service to a craft that asked everything of him, was that it was what it said it was. No internal compromises, no hidden weaknesses, no places where the reality fell short of the promise. A sword with a cold shut in its core was not an Ulfberht that had a small problem. It was a blade that had become, at its center, exactly the kind of dishonest thing that the Ulfberht existed to refuse to be. Halvard knew this better than he knew almost anything. He had known it for 30 years, and he was standing at his anvil at the age of 63, 6 weeks into work that had already asked enormous things of his body and his concentration, looking at a cold shut in the core section of the blade he was making, and the weight of that knowledge was pressing on him from all sides. Sigrun did not speak. He had learned, in the weeks of their working together, that there were moments when the correct thing to do was to simply be present and quiet, to hold the space without filling it, the way a good bellows holds air without forcing it. He stood beside Halvard and looked at the billet and did not ask questions and did not offer suggestions and did not make the situation worse with the kind of anxious helpfulness that people produce when they cannot bear a difficult silence. Halvard was grateful for this in a way that he could not have articulated without embarrassment. He stood for a long time. The fire breathed behind him. The billet sat on the anvil. The cold shut sat inside the billet, patient and factual, making no argument, simply being what it was. The question was where it was, not its location along the length of the piece. He could see that clearly enough, but its depth. How far into the interior of the billet did it reach? Was it a shallow flaw, confined to a single layer near the surface, something that could theoretically be cut away with enough material remaining to continue? Or did it run deep, through multiple layers, through the center of the piece, through the carefully built-up arrangement of crucible steel and wrought iron that represented 6 weeks and the better part of Halvard's remaining store of fine-quality charcoal? To answer this question, he would need to cut into it, and cutting into it would tell him either that the flaw was manageable or that 6 weeks of work were ruined. Both possibilities were real. He could not know which was true without looking, and looking meant committing to the knowledge and everything that came with it. He picked up his hammer, not to strike, just to have it in his hand, to feel the familiar weight of it, the worn handle that had shaped itself over the decades to the particular grip of his right hand, so that it felt less like a tool he held, and more like an extension of himself. "I'm going to cut it," he said. Sigrun moved to the far side of the anvil, ready to assist if needed, staying out of the way if not. He positioned himself as Halvard had taught him, present but unobtrusive, available but not pressing. The apprentice's particular art of being useful without being a demand. Halvard worked a chisel into the billet at the location of the cold shut, bringing the piece to heat first, working heat, not welding heat, a temperature that would allow him to cut cleanly without the metal flowing where he did not want it to flow. He worked slowly, precisely, with the kind of attention that shuts out everything except the object immediately in front of you. His back ached. His knee ached. He did not particularly notice either. The chisel went in. The cut opened. He looked. It was deep, not all the way through. The flaw did not run completely through the cross-section of the billet, which would have been the kind of damage that closed the conversation immediately and entirely. But it went through approximately half the thickness of the piece, cutting through several of the carefully welded layers, compromising the interior structure in a way that could not be hammered away, could not be rewelded in the ordinary course of continuing the work. The layers on the affected side were separated from each other, where the cold shut ran, like the pages of a book that has been soaked in water and dried, still present, still in the right order, but no longer bonded in the way that gave them strength. Halvard set down the chisel. He straightened his back slowly. He looked at the ceiling of the smithy for a moment, which was a thing he did when he was working through something that he did not want to be working through. Then he looked at Sigrun. "The core section is lost," he said. "We have to start again." The words came out flatly, with neither drama nor collapse. The way he had long ago learned to deliver the worst news, not cushioned, not minimized, but said cleanly and directly, and then allowed to be what it was, without being made worse by the delivery. Sigrun absorbed this with the same quality of stillness he brought to everything. His face showed the impact, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible setting of the jaw, but he did not flinch, and he did not say anything immediately, and he did not do any of the things that people do when they are trying to make themselves feel better about bad news, rather than simply receiving the bad news. "How much of the material is recoverable?" he asked, after a moment. "Good question, the right question." Halvard looked at the billet with new eyes. Not the eyes of a man mourning what was lost, but the eyes of a man assessing what remained. The cold shut was in the core section, but the piece had other sections, the outer layers that had been added in later fold sequences, the edge sections that had been kept deliberately separate from the core work for exactly the reason that now presented itself, so that if the core had a problem, the edge material would not be contaminated by it. "The edge bars," he said. "Those are sound. I checked them yesterday." He moved to the rack where the edge sections were stored. Long bars of crucible steel that had been worked separately, maintained at their own level of development. He ran a hand along them, assessing. "These we keep. The core we start over. The crucible steel for the core," said Sigrun carefully. "We have enough." Halvard paused. He went to the corner where the remaining ingots were stored. What was left of Leif's 3 ingots after the edge sections had been cut from them. He hefted the remaining piece, turned it in his hands. There was enough, but only just. There was no margin for another failure of this kind. Whatever they built next would need to be right. "Enough," he said. "If we are careful." He set the remaining crucible steel down and stood in the middle of his smithy. The ruined core section sat on the anvil behind him. 6 weeks of work, 6 weeks of his 63-year-old body's best effort, gone. The fire was still burning. The edge bars were still sound. The morning was still young. Everything that had been taken away was behind him, and everything that needed to happen next was in front of him, and the distance between those two facts was exactly the width of a decision. He picked up his hammer. "Bank the old section," he said to Sigrun. "Cut it up for stock. We'll use what we can of it for the lesser tools later. Nothing is wasted." He moved to the forge and began positioning the remaining crucible steel in the fire. "Then come here. I'm going to show you the sequence from the beginning, and this time I'm going to tell you everything I'm doing and why, so that if my hands fail me, if my eye misses something again, you'll know what should be happening and you can tell me." Sigrun looked at him. "Your eye didn't fail you," he said. "You found it." "I found it late," said Halvard. "I should have caught it at the 4th fold. I was going too fast." He paused, and there was something in this pause that Sigrun had not heard before. Not quite humility, because Halvard was not a man who performed humility, but something beneath humility. More honest, the plain admission of a person who has high standards, and has fallen short of them, and is not going to pretend otherwise. "I was tired, and I was going too fast, and I missed it. Now we go slower." Sigrun nodded once. He went to deal with the ruined core section, and Halvard went to work rebuilding the fire, and the smithy settled back into its rhythms. The bellows, the heat, the patient cycle of effort and attention, and if the morning had a different quality than the ones before it, a quality that was heavier and more careful, freighted with the knowledge of what 6 weeks of carelessness could cost. This was not necessarily a bad thing. The best lessons are always the expensive ones. The knowledge that truly settles into the body, that changes permanently how the hands approach the work, is the knowledge that arrived in the form of a mistake that cannot be undone, only learned from, only carried forward with greater care. They started the core again that morning. Halvard worked differently this time. There is no other way to say it. The change was not dramatic. He did not become theatrical in his carefulness, did not perform attentiveness for Sigrun's benefit. What changed was something below the surface of behavior. Something in the quality of his attention that was difficult to describe, but immediately apparent to Sigrun, who had been watching Halvard work for weeks, and had developed, without fully realizing it, a very precise sense of what the old smith's full attention looked like versus his good but not complete attention. This was different. This was the full attention. At each critical temperature junction, he paused longer before striking. reading the color with total concentration, giving the metal the extra seconds it needed to be certain rather than merely probable. At each fold he checked twice, examining the surface from multiple angles in the firelight before moving to the next heat. He narrated, as he had promised, not continuously, not in a way that broke his concentration, but in the short, precise phrases of a man who has made peace with the fact that passing the knowledge on is now as important as applying it. "Watch the color at the weld line," he said, drawing a piece from the fire, "right at the junction. It should be the same across the whole surface. If there's a spot that's darker, cooler, that's where the cold shut will form. Pull it back. Give it another minute. The extra heat costs you nothing. The cold shut costs you everything." Sigrun watched. He began to see it, that slight variation in color across the surface that Halvard was describing. The way the heat was never perfectly uniform across a piece this complex. Always a little hotter here, a little cooler there, and the smith's job was to find the cool spots and address them before committing to the weld. "There," said Sigrun, pointing. "A spot near the left edge of the piece, very slightly darker than the rest. Just barely." Halvard looked at it. Back in the fire the piece went, without comment. 30 more seconds. Out again. The color was even now true, complete, the yellow-white running consistently from edge to edge. The hammer fell. The weld took. Halvard looked at Sigrun, said nothing, but something in his face, not quite a smile, more a small settling, a relaxing around the eyes, said what needed to be said. The days that followed were some of the strangest of Sigrun's young life, and he would know it later, looking back on them, as the period when he stopped being a boy who helped a smith and became something else. Not yet a smith himself, not with years of solo work and independent judgment still ahead of him, but something in between, something without a clean name, a person who has been admitted to the interior of a craft and has begun to understand it from the inside rather than observing it from without. He could feel the change happening in his hands, which now moved in the smithy with a naturalness they had not had at the beginning, reaching for tools without thinking, adjusting positions without being told, the body learning what the mind was still working to articulate, and he could feel it in his understanding of the metal, which had become not intimate. That was too large a word, but closer. He could read the color better. He could hear the hammer tones better. The difference between the sound of iron accepting a blow correctly and iron telling you something is wrong. He could feel, through the tongs, the difference between a piece that was properly hot and a piece that was holding cold in its center. That particular resistance and stiffness that meant, pull it back, give it more time, do not rush this. He was becoming, incrementally and irreversibly, a smith. This was the other thing that the crisis had given them. Besides the lesson about cold shuts and the slower, more certain way of working, time together in the forge at a different depth than before. The necessity of narrating the process had opened something between them that had been there but less visible. A mutual commitment to the work that was, stronger for having been tested. A trust between teacher and student that had moved past the early stages of formation and was now something more durable. Halvard still did not say much that was not directly relevant to the iron, but what he said landed differently now, carried more of its full meaning. The way a word lands differently when spoken by someone you have seen go through something and come out the other side. On the evening of the second week of the rebuilt core, the billet passed through a heat and came out singing that particular clarity and resonance that meant the metal was sound and the welds were good and the layers were doing what they were supposed to do. Halvard held it up in the tongs and turned it, and the firelight ran across the surface and the pattern was there, flowing and complete, uninterrupted from end to end. He held it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he set it on the hearth to cool and sat down on his stool and rolled his shoulder and did not say anything for a while. "Is it right?" said Sigrun. "Yes," said Halvard. "It's right." Outside the wind had come back from the west, pressing against the smithy walls with a long, low note that changed pitch as it moved around the angles of the building. Inside, the fire breathed in the banked-down way of a fire that has done its work for the day and is settling into the long patience of keeping its heat through the night. "The cold shut was the best thing that could have happened," said Halvard. After a while Sigrun looked at him. "How?" "Because it reminded me what this is." He gestured at the billet. "You can make 9 good things in a row and the 10th, with half your attention, and never be caught, until you are caught. And then you have to start over, and you have to go slower. And the slowness teaches you what the speed was hiding." He picked up his mead cup, which was empty, and looked at it with mild disappointment. "Failure is honest. That's the one good thing you can say for it. The fire breathed, the wind pressed, the rebuilt core sat on the hearth, sound all the way through, carrying inside it in its layered structure the record of everything it had taken to make it, the weeks and the mistake and the starting again and the going slower, and the boy who learned to see the dark spot in the yellow-white and speak before the weld was committed. All of that was in it, invisible, encoded in the grain, the way everything that a thing has been through is always present in what it becomes. The core was done, the blade was beginning. Chapter 8. The High-Carbon Heart. There are mornings that come in a forge season that are different from the other mornings, not in how they begin, not in any external sign, but in some quality of the air itself, some readiness or rightness that a person in the middle of a long piece of difficult work sometimes wakes to, recognizing it before they are fully conscious. The way you sometimes wake, knowing the weather without having seen the sky. The body knows what the mind has not yet caught up to. The hands know what the day will ask of them. And if the person waking is old enough and experienced enough to trust this knowledge, rather than talking themselves out of it, they rise and go to the forge with a quality of purpose that is different from the daily purpose of ordinary good work. Halvard woke in this way on the morning they worked the high-carbon edge. He lay in the darkness for a moment, the low pulse of the banked hearth fire in the corner of his sleeping space, the cold pressing at the walls, the distant sound of the river, and he knew, with the certainty of 51 years of this work living in his body, that today was the day, not the day of completion, that was still a long way off, but the day of the most critical step in the whole process, the step that separated what could be imitated by a skilled smith with adequate iron from what could only be achieved by the right smith with the right iron on a day when everything was precisely as it needed to be. Today they would integrate the crucible steel edge. To understand what made this step different from everything that had come before, you need to understand what a sword blade actually is, or rather, what it needs to be, which is a more interesting question, because it is a question of contradictions. A sword blade needs to be hard at its cutting edge, hard enough to take and hold a sharpness that will survive the work of battle, the repeated contact with other metal, with leather, with bone, with everything a battlefield puts in its way. But it also needs to be flexible in its core and spine, flexible enough to absorb the shock of impact without shattering, to bend under extreme force and spring back rather than breaking. Hardness and flexibility are, in almost every material, opposing properties. The harder something is, the more brittle it tends to be. The more flexible, the softer, the less able to hold a fine edge. This is the swordmaker's fundamental problem, and different metalworking traditions across history solved it in different ways. The Japanese tradition built swords with a hard outer jacket and a soft inner core, combining two types of steel in a structure that gave each material the role it was best suited for. The European pattern welding tradition did something related but different. It combined materials with different properties through the layering and welding process, distributing their different qualities through the structure of the blade in a way that produced a useful compromise. The Ulfberht went further. Its core, the part that ran through the spine of the blade, giving it flexibility and toughness, was the pattern welded section they had spent weeks building, layers of wrought iron and crucible, steel folded together, tough and resilient. But its cutting edges, the thin sections on either side that would carry the blade's sharpness into the world, those were something else. Those were crucible steel, worked carefully to preserve and maximize the very quality that made crucible steel irreplaceable, its high, evenly distributed carbon content, which was what gave it the ability to harden, to take and hold an edge of a quality that no bog iron sword and no case-hardened European steel could match. The integration of these two different sections, the tough, flexible pattern-welded core and the hard carbon-rich crucible steel edges, was the moment when the Ulfberht became itself. Everything before it was preparation. This was the commitment. Halvard explained all of this to Sigrun before they began, which was unusual. He was not, as a rule, a man who explained things in advance. He preferred to demonstrate and let the understanding arrive through watching, through doing, through the body's own process of learning from proximity to the work. But today, he stood at the unlit forge in the grey pre-dawn and spoke with a directness and completeness that told Sigrun, more clearly than any other signal, how much this step mattered. The edge bars are pure crucible steel, he said. You've seen them, dense, fine-grained, already worked to shape. Today we weld them to the core section, one on each side, so that the core is held between them. When we're done, the cross-section of the blade will be core in the center. Crucible steel running along both sides, with the edge sections thinnest at the very tip. He drew the cross-section in the air with one finger, roughly, a wide flat shape with a spine in the middle and thinning toward both edges. The welding itself is the same process as before, but the materials are different and the heat management is more critical. Crucible steel and pattern welded composite have different optimal welding temperatures. They overlap. There's a range where both can be welded, but the range is narrow and the price of getting it wrong is a cold shut in the most important location in the entire blade. Sigrun nodded. The edge. If there is a cold shut in the edge of this blade, the blade is not an Ulfberht. It is a sword. A good sword, perhaps a better sword than most, but not this. He paused. The edge is where the carbon lives. The carbon is what hardens. The hardening is what makes the edge last. If the edge welds badly, if the carbon-rich steel is not fully bonded to the core, you get either a blade that is hard at the surface and soft at the join, which means the edge can separate from the body of the blade under stress, or you get a blade that is sound structurally, but has lost some of its carbon in the welding heat, which means the edge hardens less completely than it should. He went to the forge and began building the fire. There is a temperature at which carbon in the steel begins to migrate, begins to move out of the metal into the surface, into the fire, into the air. If we go too hot, we lose what we came for. If we don't go hot enough, the weld doesn't take. So we need exactly the right heat, said Sigrun. We need exactly the right heat, confirmed Halvard, which I have found twice before in my life, and which we are going to find again today. He said this without bravado. It was simply the plan. Watch every color. Tell me what you see. 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1, and my left eye is not what it was. Sigrun moved to his position across the anvil from Halvard, close enough to see the full surface of the work, far enough to not be in the way of the hammer. He brought his attention to its full focus, the gathered, sharpened quality that was becoming, over these months, less an effort and more a natural state. The place his attention went when the work required it. The way a hawk's eyes go when they lock onto something in the distance. They built the fire for an hour before touching the metal. This was Halvard's practice on days of critical work, to bring the forge to a complete, even, stable heat, before asking it to do anything important, rather than working on a fire that was still finding its temperature, that had cold spots and hot spots, and variations that could not be predicted. The charcoal was packed and arranged with precise care, more on the right side, where Halvard needed the deepest heat, less on the left where he wanted a slightly cooler zone to move the work through in the final stages. The bellows were worked in a slow, steady rhythm, not aggressively, building the fire to exactly the point where it would sustain itself at working temperature, without needing constant attention. When it was ready, when the color and sound of the fire told Halvard that it was stable and complete, he set the core section and the first edge bar in together. They waited. The waiting is the part of forge work that outsiders never understand, because from the outside it looks like nothing is happening, and from the inside everything is happening. All of it, in the fire, in the metal, in the chemistry of heat and carbon and iron working on each other, in the way that they have worked on each other since the first human being discovered that certain rocks, placed in certain fires, produced something useful. Halvard stood at the forge and watched the color build in the 2 pieces, the core, which he knew intimately after all these weeks of working it, and the edge bar, which he also knew but differently, which had a slightly different character in the fire, because its composition was different, its response to heat subtly, but perceptibly unlike the composite core. He was looking for convergence, the moment when both pieces, despite their different natures, arrived at the same temperature, the same shade of yellow-white, the same quality of surface softness, the same readiness at the same time. This was the art within the art, not just reaching welding temperature, but reaching it together, both pieces ready in the same moment, so that when the hammer fell, both surfaces would accept the blow and each other simultaneously. The edge bar is ahead, said Sigrun quietly. Halvard looked. Yes, the edge bar's surface was slightly brighter, it had heated faster, its denser grain conducting the heat more efficiently. He adjusted the position, moving the edge bar slightly to the left where the fire was cooler, letting the core section catch up. A minute, 90 seconds. Now they're even, said Halvard's hands were already moving, tongs gripping the pieces together, drawing them from the fire, placing them on the anvil in a single continuous motion that had no hesitation in it, no pause between the seeing and the doing, because any pause was heat lost, and heat lost was failure. The hammer rose and fell in the particular sequence he had worked out over his second and third Ulfberht, and rehearsed in his mind every night since beginning this fourth. First the center, to seat the two surfaces against each other, then walking outward in both directions from the center, spreading the weld evenly, encouraging the bond to develop across the full width of the join, rather than pooling at one point. The sound was right. That deep, soft, serious sound of metal accepting metal at the correct temperature. The sound that was different from the ring of a mist, weld the way a word spoken truthfully is. Different from the same word spoken without meaning. "Is it taking?" said Sigrun, barely above a breath. "Yes," said Halvard, not stopping. "Yes." 3 passes with the hammer, back in the fire. Another heat, not to welding temperature this time, but to working temperature. To begin drawing the welded section out, to begin the process of revealing how the bond had taken across the full depth of the join, out again. The hammer working more lightly now, checking, reading, listening through the strikes to what the metal was saying about itself. What it said was, sound. What it said was, whole. What it said was, the two are now one, and the one is what you need it to be. Halvard set the hammer down. He turned the piece in the tongs, and held it in the firelight, and looked at the weld line, the place where the edge bar had been joined to the core, and the line was invisible. Not hidden, not disguised, but genuinely invisible. Because the two surfaces had bonded so completely that there was no longer a line between them in any meaningful sense. There was only the blade, composite and complete, carrying in its structure the different natures of its different parts, unified into a single object that was stronger for the union than either element had been alone. He let out a breath, a long, slow breath that had, it seemed, been waiting several hours for permission to leave. "We'll let it cool," he said, slowly. "Then we start the second edge." The second edge went more smoothly than the first, not because the work was easier, but because both of them now knew, in their bodies and their hands, what they were looking for and how to find it. The color convergence, the simultaneous readiness, the hammer sequence, all of it moved with a sureness that the first edge had required them to build fresh. Sigrun's, I caught the moment of readiness half a second before. Halvard would have drawn the pieces from the fire, not because he was faster or better, but because from his angle the light fell differently on the surface of the edge bar, and the convergence showed itself there, before it showed itself from Halvard's position. "Now," said Sigrun, "the pieces came from the fire." The hammer fell. The weld took. By the time the pale winter light was beginning to fade toward afternoon, and the cold was pressing harder against the smithy walls, both edges were welded, and the piece that lay on the hearth cooling was, for the first time, truly and recognizably, a sword. Not yet in shape, not yet ground, not yet close to the finished blade that a warrior would one day hold, but a sword in potential. The way a seed is a tree in potential, carrying within its structure everything that the final form would require, waiting for the work that would reveal it. The high carbon heart, the thing that made the Ulfberht, the clean steel, evenly carbonized all the way through its grain, bonded now to the tough, flexible core. The two natures held in each other's company, each making the other more capable than it could be alone. Halvard looked at it for a long time. He was tired in a way that went past the body and into something deeper, the tiredness of a person who has given a very important performance and has come through it intact. But beneath the tiredness, accessible if he reached for it, was something else, a quiet, factual satisfaction, the kind that does not announce itself, but simply sits there, solid and warm, like the embers in the forge after the day's work is done. "The heart is in," he said. Sigrun looked at the piece on the hearth. In the last of the daylight, the surface of the composite showed its pattern, core and edge together now. The flowing lines of the pattern-welded center, transitioning into the finer grain of the crucible steel edge. The whole, a record in iron of everything that had gone into it, every decision, every heat, every carefully timed moment of convergence. "It knows what it is," said Sigrun softly, almost to himself. Halvard looked at him. "Yes," he said, "now it does." Chapter 9. Quench the moment between. For 3 more weeks after the edges were welded, the blade was shaped. This is the part of sword making that looks most like what the imagination produces when it thinks of a blacksmith at work. The long sessions of careful hammering that draw the metal out into its final proportions, that establish the taper of the blade from hilt to tip, that create the fuller, the shallow channel running along the center of the flat, that reduces weight without reducing strength. The thing that people sometimes call a blood groove, for reasons that are more romantic than accurate. that bevel the edges toward their eventual sharpness, that define the geometry of the crossguard and tang that would eventually accept the grip and pummel. It was meticulous work, slow and precise, requiring Halvard to hold the finished shape in his mind at all times, not as a vague intention, but as a specific detailed form, measuring the actual piece against the imagined one with every heat, correcting, adjusting, bringing the two into agreement, millimeter by millimeter through the accumulated authority of the hammer. Sigrun worked the bellows, held pieces when a second pair of hands was needed, watched and learned and asked careful questions during the pauses, and gradually began to understand the shape logic of the blade. Why the taper was this angle and not that one, why the fuller was placed where it was, how the balance point was being managed through the distribution of mass along the length. By the third week, the blade was within sight of its final form. The grinding would take it further. The rough surface left by hammerwork would be worked smooth, the bevels refined, the edges brought toward their eventual sharpness. But before the grinding, before any of that final refinement, there was one more step that would determine everything. The most critical, the most unrepeatable, the most unforgiving moment in the entire process. The quench, hardening steel by plunging the hot blade into cold water or brine to lock the crystalline structure of the steel in its hardened configuration, is a step that cannot be undone. It cannot be repeated if it goes wrong. It cannot be adjusted mid-process or refined after the fact. It is a single, committed, irreversible action, and it is the action that finally transforms the blade from a carefully made object of iron and steel into something that will hold an edge and bear the weight of its purpose. The science behind it is this: steel at high temperature has a particular crystalline structure. The carbon atoms are dissolved into the iron lattice, evenly distributed, mobile. When the steel cools slowly, as it does when left to cool in air, the carbon has time to move, to migrate out of the lattice and form carbide compounds at the grain boundaries, and the result is steel that is tough and workable, but relatively soft. When the steel is cooled rapidly, plunged into cold water or brine, dropping its temperature in seconds rather than hours, the carbon has no time to move. It is frozen in place, locked into the iron lattice in a strained, energetic configuration called martensite, and this configuration is very hard, harder than slowly cooled steel by a significant margin, hard enough to hold the edge that all those weeks of careful work had been building toward. But rapid cooling is also the source of its own danger. The sudden temperature change creates stresses in the metal, the outside cools faster than the inside, and the difference in contraction rates creates internal tension. In steel with slag inclusions, with cold shuts, with any of the internal weaknesses that impure iron accumulates, this tension has something to act on. The crack goes where the weakness is, and a crack in a quench is not something that can be hammered out or reheated away. It is the end. The blade before them had no slag inclusions, no cold shuts. They had learned that lesson, and they had learned it completely. It had no internal weaknesses, because they had built it without them. What it had was the best possible preparation for the moment that was coming. But preparation was not certainty. Halvard had quenched 3 Ulfberht blades in his life. 2 had come through perfectly. The third, on his second Ulfberht, the one made at age 44, had cracked along the fuller, a crack so clean and complete that it had split the blade into 2 pieces that could be held up and compared like bookends. He had stood in the smithy that day for a very long time without moving. Then he had put both pieces in the scrap pile, waited 2 weeks, and started again. The second attempt had been the blade he considered the finest of the 3 he had completed, but he had never forgotten the crack. He carried it the way a man carries a fall. He survived, not constantly, not obsessively, but present in the background of relevant moments, available as a reminder of the distance between careful and certain. He chose a night for the quench. Not a day, a night, well into the dark, when the temperature of the smithy had settled and stabilized, when there were no visitors and no sounds from the village to interrupt the quality of attention required, when the only things present were the fire and the blade and the trough of brine that had been prepared the day before. The brine salt water, which transferred heat away from the metal faster than plain water and produced a more uniform quench, had been brought to a specific temperature, cold, but not the extreme cold of the night air outside, which could be too violent, cold enough to do its work. Controlled. Sigrun was there. He had not been asked to leave. Halvard had not said to him, explicitly, "You should be here for this." But he had said nothing to suggest otherwise, which Sigrun had correctly interpreted as an invitation. He stood at his usual position, across from the anvil, and he was very still. Halvard brought the blade to heat slowly. Not working heat, this was a different temperature. The specific heat required for hardening, which was lower than welding heat and higher than working temperature for most purposes. A precise band of color that was a medium bright orange, the color of the sky just at the horizon a few minutes after sunset, when the last of the direct light is gone but the glow remains. In the old Norse smithing tradition, this color was sometimes described as the color of a fox in summer firelight, which is as accurate a description as any. Warm, vivid, alive, neither too bright nor too dark. He brought the blade to this color and held it there, moving it through the fire slowly, maintaining the temperature evenly across the full length of the blade, not letting the tip run ahead of the middle or the middle run ahead of the shoulder. This took 20 minutes of slow, constant management, adjusting the position, reading the color, waiting, adjusting again. Sigrun worked the bellows in a rhythm so consistent it almost ceased to be a conscious action and became instead simply a function of the room, like breathing. When the color was even, truly even, from the tip of the blade to the temps, the whole length of it glowing with the same temperature, Halvard drew it from the fire. He held it in the tongs, horizontal, over the trough. He looked at it for 2 seconds, not checking he knew it was ready. He had known it for the last 30 seconds. The 2 seconds was something else. The pause of a person at the edge of the unrepeatable. The breath before the commitment. The last moment in which the thing is still possible, but has not yet become actual. He put it in. The sound a quench makes is unlike any other sound in the smithy. It is not a single sound but a cascade, a fierce initial hiss, almost a roar, as the surface of the hot steel hits the cold brine and a cloud of steam erupts immediately from the contact, boiling off the surface of the blade and surrounding it in a sheath of vapor. Then the hiss begins to settle and modulate as the outer surface cools and the temperature differential between blade and brine begins to decrease, the sound changing from the initial violence to something more continuous, a sustained sizzle that is the sound of the interior of the blade, still giving up its heat through the now cooled outer surface. And beneath and behind all of this, if you are listening with the specific attention of a person who has done this before, or been present for it, there is the quality of the sound itself, the tone of it which tells you imperfectly, which tellity with significant, the tellity, with tellity penicadit, which tellity pethakin, bever kinefli, pilifikifikal with, bever plant pipip, plipin pleful with, piluxlick, ink, bepwef, with sig. If with a kink with or with wake with quip with ga for bow head with quick kawik we put up with ha up ga we got laugh at stars says out or ga gas good luftig ha get best the passive stood sis gas wood mixed cut dispersed all this so the left is Halvard listened. He moved the blade through the brine as it quenched slowly, in a figure-8 motion that he had used on all 3 previous quenches, which provided even cooling without creating currents that could cool one side of the blade faster than the other. The tongs were steady in his hands. His face was unreadable. His eyes were on the brine and the blade and the steam and the 1,000 small signals that were streaming toward him from all of them, all of it being processed by 51 years of attention and experience and the particular kind of knowledge that lives past words. Sigrun was not breathing. He became aware of this fact at some point in the first 30 seconds and took a careful, deliberate breath and then returned to the stillness that was not absence but presence. Full presence, every part of his attention directed at the man and the blade and the brine and the sound. The hiss continued, the steam continued, the figure-8 motion continued, slow and even, Halvard's arm moving with a patience that seemed impossible given what was happening at the end of the tongs, at approximately 2 minutes, though neither of them was counting. Time having done the thing it does in moments of extreme attention, where it seems to expand and compress simultaneously, the sound changed. Not dramatically, not with any sudden shift, but with a gradual quieting, the hiss modulating toward a low, sustained whisper as the temperature differential decreased and the rate of heat transfer slowed. The steam, which had been dense and continuous, thinned. The surface of the brine, which had been turbulent around the blade, settled. Halvard lifted the blade from the trough. He held it up. The firelight fell across it, and the blade was there, the whole blade, the length of it intact, the geometry of it preserved. the surface dark and wet from the brine, and already beginning to show, through the dark, the clean lines of its shape. He turned it slowly. He ran his eye along the edge. He looked at the fuller, at the shoulder, at the tip. He examined the surface from every angle that the firelight allowed. No crack. He set it down on the stone beside the trough, very carefully. Then he straightened up and stood without moving for a long moment, his hands at his sides, his face still carrying the quality of complete attention that had not yet entirely released. Sigrun let his breath out. He had not been aware of holding it again. It held, he said. It was not a question. It was the only thing to say. It held, said Hal. The fire breathed. The steam from the trough dispersed into the air of the smithy and was gone. The blade lay on the stone, dark and cooling, a physical object in the world, real and complete, and what it had always been meant to be, arrived now at its hardened state. The carbon locked in the martensite of its grain, the edge capable of what it had always been built to be capable of, the long weeks and the difficult weeks, and the mistake and the starting again all present in it, encoded in its structure, inseparable from what it had become. Halvard sat down. He sat on the floor of the smithy, which was something Sigrun had never seen him do, not on a stool, not on the low bench, but on the earthen floor, his back against the stone of the forge housing, his legs extended in front of him, a man at the end of something very large. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Sigrun. "Get some water," he said. "Both of us." Sigrun got the water. He filled 2 cups from the clay pot kept by the door and brought them across the smithy and sat down on the floor across from Halvard, which felt like the right thing to do. And they sat there in the firelight on the floor of the smithy, with their water and the quenched blade cooling between them, and did not speak for a while, and the quiet was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of 2 people who have come through something together and have no need to put it into words, because both of them were there, and both of them know what it was. After a while, Halvard raised his cup slightly. "To the iron," he said. "For holding." "To the iron," said Sigrun. They drank. The fire breathed. The blade cooled. The night held everything, vast and still and ancient, in its dark and patient hands. Chapter 10. The name carved in steel. After the quench, the blade went through 3 days of tempering, a controlled reheating to a lower temperature that relieved some of the internal stresses created by the rapid hardening, reducing the brittleness that maximum hardness always brings, while preserving most of the hardness itself. This was a quieter process than what had preceded it, more meditative. The blade going into a more modest heat and being watched with patient attention and then allowed to cool in air rather than brine. Halvard managed the temperature by color. The particular stray yellow and bronze and blue sequence of colors that appeared on the polished steel as it was gently heated told him, with the precision of a language he had been reading for 50 years, exactly what was happening to the metal's internal structure and when to stop. Sigrun watched the colors appear and disappear on the steel's surface and thought they were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen produced in the smithy. Not the dramatic beauty of the forge welding heat, not the fierce bright beauty of the quench. Something quieter, a slow procession of color, straw, 2 gold, 2 brown, 2 purple, 2 blue, moving across the polished steel like weather moves across a hillside, unhurried and inevitable. After tempering came the grinding and polishing. This was long, physical work, less hot than the forge work, less dramatically tense, but demanding in its own way, requiring a patience and consistency that made different demands on the body than the hammering had. The blade was worked first with coarse abrasive stone, then finer again, each stage removing the scratches left by the stage before, the surface becoming smoother and brighter with each progression, until the final stages brought it to a clarity that was almost unsettling, a surface so smooth it reflected the smithy in miniature, fire and walls, and the blurred figures of smith and apprentice reproduced in the steel as in a dark mirror. As the grinding progressed, the pattern revealed itself fully for the first time. Sigrun had seen it before, glimpsed it in the heats of the working process, caught its suggestion in the rough surface of the formed blade, but the grinding opened it as the dawn opens a landscape, gradually, and then fully, and then completely, until what lay before them on the grinding stone was a blade whose surface was alive with the particular flowing patterning of the pattern-welded core, the lines of the wrought iron and crucible steel integration running in their sinuous, organic complexity from shoulder to tip, neither random nor geometric, the record of every fold and every heat made visible and permanent on the surface of the finished thing. Halvard stood over the blade for a long moment when the final polishing was complete. The fire was banked low, they needed little heat now, and the smithy was quieter than it had been in months. He picked the blade up and held it flat in both hands and turned it so the firelight moved across the surface, and the pattern moved with the light, shifting and shimmering as the angle changed. Alive in the way that only patterned steel is alive, the living record of an unrepeatable process, the history of its own making worn on its skin. "Now," said Halvard, setting it down with care. "The name. The inscription on the Ulfberht sword is one of the most recognized marks in the history of European metalwork. The letters plus VLFBERHT plus rendered in that particular style, with the cross marks at either end and the letters in between, appear on a number of surviving blades from the Carolingian and Viking-age, spanning a period from roughly the 9th to the 11th centuries. Scholars have argued about what the name originally signified. A workshop, a smith, a lineage of craftsmen who passed the technique and the mark from one generation to the next. The most widely accepted view is that it began as the mark of a particular Frankish smith or workshop and was subsequently adopted, legitimately by those who had learned the technique, fraudulently by those who had only learned to copy the letters. What is beyond scholarly argument is that the inscription required a specific and demanding technique to produce. The letters were not stamped onto the surface of the finished blade, not engraved with a chisel in the conventional sense, not applied as surface decoration after the fact. They were inlaid, constructed from twisted wire of iron, pressed and hammered into channels cut into the blade's surface, then heated and worked until the wire became part of the blade itself, bonded to it, inseparable from it. The letters built into the steel rather than written on top of it. This mattered. It mattered because it meant the inscription could not simply be removed and reapplied. A forger who wanted to put the Ulfberht name on a lesser blade could scratch the letters into the surface, or stamp them in, and from a distance the effect might be similar. But the inlaid inscription had a quality, a depth, a relationship to the surface of the blade, that a trained eye could recognize, and that a dishonest inscription could not fully replicate. The name was part of the blade. The blade was the name. Halvard prepared the channels for the inlay with a small, precise chisel, not the heavy tools of the forge work, but delicate instruments, almost surgical, made for this specific purpose and used carefully. He cut the letters into the flat of the blade on one side, not deep, perhaps 2 millimeters, carefully following lines he had traced first with a soft charcoal stick. The cutting was slow. One slip, one channel cut too deep or too wide, and the letter would be misshapen. And a misshapen letter in the Ulfberht inscription was not something he was willing to accept. Sigrun had asked, before the cutting began, whether he could watch from very close. Halvard had said yes. The boy crouched beside the workbench and watched from perhaps 30 centimeters away, his breathing slow and controlled so as not to disturb the dust or the smith's concentration. And he saw the letters emerge from the surface of the blade, under the chisel's careful work with the same quality of inevitability that he had been seeing throughout the entire process. The sense that the thing being revealed had always been there, waiting, and the work was simply the act of removing what was in front of it. Plus VLFBERHT 7 letters, 2 cross marks, 1 name. The channels were cut clean and even, the floor of each one smooth enough to accept the wire that would fill it. Halvard took a length of twisted iron wire, thin, worked to a specific diameter over a small mandrel, the twisting giving it a texture that would bond better than plain wire to the channel walls, and began pressing it into the first channel. He used a smooth wooden stick to press the wire home, working it into the channel section by section, keeping the tension even so that the wire lay flat and full in the space prepared for it, without gaps or humps. When all the channels were filled, the blade went back into a carefully controlled heat, low, precise, enough to soften the wire and the channel walls slightly so that when the wire was struck it would bond to the channel. Not forge welding heat, not anywhere near it, just the temperature of a very gentle conversation between the wire and the blade. Enough to make them willing to become the same thing. The hammerwork on the inlay was the lightest Halvard had done in the entire process. Small hammer, light blows, working across the wire in the channel so that it spread slightly and filled the space completely, bonding at the sides and floor of the channel, becoming inseparable from the blade around it. Between each set of blows he examined the work with his eyes very close to the surface, looking for gaps, for wire that had not fully set, for any place where the letter was not yet what it needed to be. It took the better part of 2 days. When it was done, the surface of the inscription area was dressed smooth, the wire that had risen slightly above the surface of the blade worked down, level with the surrounding steel, the whole finished to match the polish of the rest of the blade. And then the inscription appeared in its final form, not as a mark on the surface, but as a difference in the surface, a section of the blade where the polished steel carried within it the inlaid letters, the twisted wire catching the light slightly differently from the surrounding metal, legible and permanent, built into the thing itself. Plus, VLFBERHT Halvard set down his tools. He looked at the inscription, then he looked at Sigrun. "Do you know what the fakes get wrong?" he said. Sigrun looked at the inscription, thinking the iron, he said. "The steel inside, not the letters." "Yes," said Halvard. "A man who cannot read will never know the difference between these letters and scratched ones. A man who can read still won't know the difference, just from the letters. The difference is in what's underneath the letters, what the letters are standing on." He picked up the blade, held it flat, felt its weight distributed across his palms. "The inscription is a truth claim. It says, this is what this is. The only thing that makes the claim honest is that underneath it, the blade actually is what the name says it is." He paused. "Plenty of men have put this name on blades that didn't deserve it. The name didn't make those blades true. The name never makes anything true. Only the thing underneath it can do that." Sigrun looked at the blade in Halvard's hands. The pattern moved in the firelight. The inscription caught the light from its own angle. The whole of the blade was present and complete, each part of it made to the same standard as every other part. The name and the steel in honest agreement, saying the same thing. "Is it finished?" he said. "The blade is finished," said Halvard. "The sword still needs its fittings, the crossguard, the grip, the pommel. A craftsman in the village makes those better than I do. He'll work from my measurements." He set the blade down very carefully. "But the part that is ours, this is done." He stood looking at it for a long moment. 51 years of the truest knowledge in the north. 3 previous Ulfberht swords gone out into the world before this one. A bad knee, a missing thumb, a left eye not as sharp as it once was, and a young apprentice with the best quality of attention Halvard had encountered in half a century of looking. All of it present in the blade, lying on the bench in the firelight of the smithy at the far end of Keldvik. The snow outside and the stars above, and the river moving under its ice with a patient, underground murmur of a thing that knows it will outlast the current season. Halvard said Sigrun. "Yes, I want to make one," he said. "Someday, I want to know how to make one." Halvard looked at him. The boy was 15 now, 4 years older than the morning he had appeared at the smithy door in his father's oversized cloak, and sat on that stool without being asked, and watched without speaking. His hands were a smith's hands already, marked and capable. His eyes were already reading things that most people could not see. He had 4 years of the real knowledge in him, the knowledge that lived in the body and couldn't be taken away. "You already know how to make one," said Halvard. Sigrun looked at him. "You've been here for all of it," said Halvard. "Every heat, every fold, every decision. You've seen everything I've done and why. You've caught things I missed." He turned back to the blade. "The only thing left between you and making one is time, and iron, and the willingness to start over when it goes wrong." He paused. "Which it will." "I know," said Sigrun. "Good," said Halvard. "Then you know the most important thing." Chapter 11. The warrior who came at dawn, the Jarl, who came for the sword, arrived before sunrise. This was not expected. The commission had been made through intermediaries, the usual distance of formality and rank, and Halvard had been told to expect the pickup in the daylight hours when the roads were passable and a man of standing could travel with appropriate company. But the world does not always observe its own protocols. And on the morning, 3 days after the fittings were completed and the sword had become fully itself, blade and crossguard and grip and pommel, balanced and whole, wrapped in oiled linen in the corner of the smithy, Halvard heard horses in the village before the sky had lightened past grey, and then boots on frozen ground, and then a knock at the smithy door that had the particular quality of a knock that expects to be answered. He opened the door. The Jarl was younger than Halvard had imagined from the commission. This was perhaps not surprising. He had been forming a picture from second-hand information. The way you form a picture of someone you have heard about but not met, and such pictures are rarely accurate. He had imagined someone older, more settled, a man with years of authority on his face and the particular stillness of someone who had earned his position through long experience. What stood at the door of his smithy, instead, was a young man, not a boy, not without his own presence and gravity, but young, perhaps 25, with the kind of directness in his eyes that belongs to people who have not yet learned to look at the world sideways, who still approach things straighten. He had 2 companions who stayed with the horses, which was the right call. The smithy was a working space and not a hall, and bringing an entourage into it would have been the wrong kind of theatre. He came in alone, ducking his head slightly under the lintel, and stood in the smithy and looked at it with a curiosity that was unself-conscious and somehow likable. The curiosity of someone who has never been in a smithy before and is not pretending otherwise. "Halvard Ironhand," he said. "Yes," said Halvard. "I'm told you have something for me." "I do," said Halvard. "Sit, if you like. It's not ready to be handed over in a hurry." The Jarl looked at him. Something moved in his face, not quite surprise, but a recalibration. He sat on the low bench against the wall, the one visitors occasionally used, and waited. He did not fidget. Halvard noted this approvingly. Sigrun was there. He was always there, sitting on his stool in his corner, quiet and unobtrusive in the way he had long since mastered, the way that allowed him to be present in a space without changing it. The Jarl looked at him briefly, assessed him as an apprentice, and returned his attention to Halvard. Halvard went to the corner where the wrapped sword lay and crouched down beside it, slowly, his knee announcing its objection, and unwrapped the oiled linen with care. He took the sword out and stood and held it horizontal in both hands, and turned to the Jarl and held it out. "Take it," he said. "Both hands. Feel the weight." The Jarl stood. He crossed the smithy and placed his hands under the sword, and Halvard transferred the weight to him. And the Jarl stood, holding it with his eyes on the blade, and something happened in his face that Halvard had seen before. On 2 of the 3 previous occasions, he had placed a finished Ulfberht in someone's hands. It was not an expression of pleasure, exactly, or not only that, it was the expression of recognition, the face of a person who has just handled something that is exactly what they hoped it would be, and that they had not been entirely certain would be, and whose hope has been met so completely that the meeting registers physically, in the stillness of the hands, and the particular quality of attention in the eyes. "It's lighter than I expected," said the Jarl. "It's not lighter," said Halvard. "It's balanced. There's a difference. A sword that's heavy in the wrong places feels heavy. A sword that's balanced feels lighter than its weight. Hold it by the grip. Feel how the balance sits." The Jarl took the grip, wrapped his hand around it, a good, full grip, his hand the right size for what Halvard had built, and held the sword out. He moved it slightly, feeling the arc it wanted to move in. The way a blade that is correctly balanced will suggest its own motion, will feel eager in the hand rather than reluctant. "Yes," he said, quietly. "Yes, I see. The point of balance is 2 fingers width ahead of the crossguard," said Halvard. "That's deliberate. It gives you cut at the end of the stroke without making the blade feel nose-heavy in the recovery. You'll find it fast in close work and strong on the swing. Don't choke up on the grip. The balance is designed for the full grip length." The Jarl nodded, absorbing this. He was watching the blade as Halvard spoke, turning it to see how the light moved on the surface, how the pattern shifted and shimmered in the firelight. "The pattern," he said. "The record of the making," said Halvard. "Every fold of the welding is in there. You can see it because the different metals take the light differently. It's not decoration. It's the history of the blade, worn on the surface." The Jarl looked at it for another long moment. Then he looked at Halvard. "The inscription," he said, "is this." He stopped. "It's the real one," said Halvard. "Made with the right iron, not the letter on top of a lesser blade. The iron underneath is what the name says it is." The Jarl looked back at the blade. Something had settled in his face, the recalibration of a moment ago now complete, the picture fully formed and accepted. He held the sword with the particular quality of care that marks a person who understands what they are holding. Halvard watched him. He watched him the way he had always watched the people who came to take the things he had made, not possessively. He had made peace with the passing of the work a very long time ago, but with the particular attention of a maker observing the moment when the made thing enters the world fully, ceases to be in the process of becoming, and becomes simply what it is, in someone else's hands. He thought about Gunnar on the frozen river. He thought about the Jarl to valleys distant, who had carried the first Ulfberht for 20 years. He thought about the cold shut, and the starting again, and the mornings before dawn, and the evenings after dark, and the particular quality of a fire that had been built to exactly the right temperature, and held there with patience and care. He thought about Sigrun sitting on his stool in the corner with his smith's hands and his seeing eyes, and for years of the real knowledge inside him. "I need to say something to you," Halvard said. The Jarl looked up. "This blade will not fail you," said Halvard. The words came out simply, without emphasis or performance. They were not a sales claim, not a craftsman's boast. They were a statement of fact, and they were delivered as such, with the gravity of someone who understands exactly what they are saying and why. Not in cold weather, when other swords become brittle. Not in hard use, when other blades chip or crack. Not under stress that would expose the weaknesses in lesser iron. The steel inside this blade has no weaknesses to expose. It is what it is, all the way through. He paused. That is all I can do. The sword's part is done. He looked at the young Jarl directly. Do not fail it. The Jarl left before the village was properly awake. The sound of horses departing carried briefly through the cold air and then faded, and Kelvik continued its ordinary morning without knowing that something extraordinary had passed through it at dawn. Halvard stood in the open door of the smithy for a while after the horses were gone. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the particular slow brightening that comes in winter, the light arriving without urgency, taking its time about it, as though the day has a long journey ahead and sees no point in rushing the beginning. The snow on the roofs of the village was blue-white in the predawn. The river could be heard faintly, its winter voice low and continuous under the ice. Sigrun came and stood beside him. They watched the light come up. Do you think he'll understand what he has? Sigrun said, after a while. Halvard considered this. Some of it, he said. The part you can feel with your hands. He felt already. The balance, the weight, the part you can see. He saw the pattern, the inscription. The part you can only know by being in a bad situation with it. That part he'll learn when he needs to. He paused. If he's lucky, he'll never need to. If he's unlucky, he'll be glad he had it. And the part about the iron, said Sigrun. The crucible's steel, the folds, the cold shut we started over after. He looked out at the village. He doesn't know about any of that. No, said Halvard. He doesn't need to. The sword knows. The iron knows. That's enough. They stood for a while longer. The light was fully coming now, the blue-white of the snow warming toward gold, the shadows pulling back, the village shapes sharpening from grey to solid. Somewhere, a cowload, a door opened. The day began its ordinary business. Halvard felt the space where the sword had been. Not a loss, not quite, but a kind of completion. The way you feel the quiet after a long piece of music ends. The particular quality of an ending that was the point all along. He had made for Ulfberht's swords. He did not know if he would make a fifth. His knee hurt. His shoulder had been speaking to him all morning. He was 63 years old, but the work was done, and the work was right, and somewhere ahead of the morning, riding away into a world that would not be kind to him in all its seasons, but that would not break his sword when it mattered. The young Jarl was carrying it. That was enough. That had always been enough. Close the fire down, said Halvard, turning back inside. Clean the anvil. Put the tools away properly. He moved toward the back of the smithy. Then go home and sleep. You've earned it. And you, said Sigrun. I'll sleep too, said Halvard. Presently, he sat down on the floor again, his back against the forge housing. His bad leg extended and looked at the space on the bench where the wrapped sword had lain. The oiled linen was still there, folded loosely, the shape it had held now gone. The forge fire breathed behind him. The anvil, which had known 6 months of this particular work, stood solid and dark and unremarked, as anvils always stand, without comment, without need. He was tired, very tired, and underneath the tiredness was the other thing, the clean thing, the warm thing, and he sat with it quietly in the early morning of his smithy for a while, listening to the fire, while Sigrun moved around him with the careful efficiency of someone who has learned exactly how to inhabit a space. And the village outside gathered itself into its full morning, and the sword rode away, and the world went on being the world, vast and difficult, and occasionally capable of containing something true. Chapter 12. The fire that never goes out. And now, little one, now we come back. Come back from the frozen village, and the forge fire and the river moving under its ice. Come back from Halvard's hands and Sigrun's eyes, and the young Jarl riding away into a morning that was 1,000 years ago. Come back to the longhouse, to the fire that is lower now than when we began, to the old woman's voice that has carried us all this way and is still here, still steady, still present in the dark. Astrid looked at the children around her. The smallest was fully asleep, her breathing slow and even as tidewater, a small smile on her face as though whatever dream had found her was a kind one. The older girl was very nearly there, her eyes closed, her body relaxed, held between the story and sleep in the soft borderland where the two become the same thing. Only the boy was still awake, still watching Astrid with the particular focused attention of a child who needs to know how the story ends before he can let himself sleep, who has an investment in the conclusion that will not allow for the shortcut of simply drifting off before it arrives. "Is it still there?" he asked. His voice was small in the firelit dark. "The sword, is it still somewhere?" Astrid looked at the fire for a moment. The flames had settled into their late-night form, low and meditative, more light than heat, the coals beneath them glowing with the deep, interior orange that is the color of a fire that has been burning long and intends to go on burning. "Some of them are," she said, "in the ground, in the north, in graves and bogs, and the deep cold places where the earth keeps things, sleeping, waiting to be found. People find them sometimes, very far from now, in a time I cannot see. And when they do, they hold them and wonder how such a thing was made in an age that everyone thought was simple and poor and without the knowledge to produce it." She paused, and then the wondering leads to the questions, and the questions lead to the answers, and the answers lead back here, to the iron, to the fire, to hell. "Did Sigrun become a smith?" the boy asked. "He became the smith," said Astrid. "After Halvard was gone, he worked the same forge for 40 years. He made good iron and excellent iron, and once, when he was 47, the right iron came from the east again, and he made an Ulfberht of his own. One, he knew, as Halvard had known, that you made it when you had the iron and the knowledge together, and no more often than that." "And did he pass the knowledge on?" "To his apprentice," said Astrid, "and the apprentice to the next. Some chains are longer than the people in them. Some knowledge travels farther than the feet of any one person could carry it." The boy was quiet for a moment, thinking this over with the earnest thoroughness of children who take stories seriously, who understand, at the level below articulation, that a story well told is not decoration but a form of reality, a way of holding something true in the air between the teller and the listener, so that both of them can see it. "What about the sword that Halvard made?" he said. "The fourth one, the one the young Jarl took." Astrid shook her head gently. "I don't know," she said. "Nobody knows. It went out into the world, and the world is large, and swords, even true ones, eventually go where everything goes." She looked at the fire. "But here is the thing I believe, though I cannot prove it. The sword doesn't disappear. Not really. Not the iron. Iron stays. Iron rusts and changes, but the substance of it remains. In the ground, in the water, in the earth, that holds everything that has ever been put into it. And the pattern in the iron, the record of the making, the folds and the welds, and the crucible steel, and the cold shut that sent them back to begin again. That pattern is still there, in whatever form the iron has taken, encoded in the grain of it. You cannot unfold iron once it has been folded. The history is permanent." The boy considered this for a long time. The fire breathed. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like a long, slow breath. "I want to be a smith," the boy said suddenly, with the certainty of someone who has just decided something irrevocable. Astrid looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has heard something true and is not going to argue with it. "Then you will need to learn patience," she said, "and to listen very carefully to things that don't speak in words, like the iron, like the fire, like your own hands when they tell you something is wrong before your mind catches up." She adjusted the fur around the sleeping youngest child. "And you will need to make mistakes. I'll try not to." "No," said Astrid, with a gentleness that had conviction in it. "Don't try not to. The mistake is part of the making. Halvard made a mistake on his last Ulfberht, the greatest work of his life. 6 weeks of effort, lost, and he started again. And the blade that came from the starting again was truer than anything he could have made without the failure, because the failure taught him something that success had been hiding." She paused. The cold shut was the best thing that could have happened. He knew it. At the end, the boy looked at the fire. His eyes were heavy now, the story finding its natural end, the weight of all those warm, well-told words settling into his body and carrying him toward the sleep that had been waiting patiently all along. "Astrid," he said, his voice slower now. "Yes, the name, Ulfberht. Who was he?" "Nobody knows," said Astrid. "A smith, perhaps. A workshop. A tradition that took a name and made the name mean something so completely that the name and the thing became inseparable." She reached out and smoothed the hair back from the boy's forehead, the gesture so old and ordinary and human that it belonged to every time at once. "Some names are bigger than the people who first bore them. The name stayed because the iron deserved it, because when you held the sword and used it and trusted your life to it, it was exactly what the name promised. No more, no less. Exactly. Her voice was very quiet now, barely above the fire's breathing. That is a harder thing to achieve than fame. Harder than power. Harder than most things the world calls great. The boy's eyes were closed. She watched his breathing slow and even. Watched the boy go away into sleep with the story following him, folding itself into whatever form it would take in his dreaming. The orange fire, and the ringing hammer, and the old smiths. Scarred hands, and the young apprentices' seeing eyes, and the dark brine and the steam, and the pattern rising out of the polished steel like a river seen from above. She sat for a while after all three children were sleeping. There was no particular reason to sit, and every reason to go to her own rest. But she sat anyway, the way you sometimes sit after a story has been told all the way through, in the quiet that follows it, feeling the shape of it in the air. From very far away, or perhaps closer than it seemed, the cold playing tricks with distance, as it always did, came the sound of Halvard's hammer. Faint, rhythmic, the sound of metal being asked to become something better than it was. She tilted her head and listened to it, as she had listened to it for 60 years. The sound that had been the background of her entire life, constant and workmanlike and true. She looked at the fire. It had come very low now, just the coals, the deep red orange of a fire that has given everything it had and is now giving the last of it, slowly, without drama. She would need to put another piece of wood on it before she slept, to keep the heat through the coldest part of the night. She reached for the woodpile beside her, selected a piece, and laid it carefully on the coals. The fire breathed. The wood caught. Small flames rose, tentative at first, and then with confidence. The new fuel accepting the old heat and building on it, the fire continuing past the point where it might have ended. That was the thing about fire, she thought. It required tending. It did not maintain itself. Left alone it would always, eventually, go out. But it could be passed from coal to wood, from wood to coal, from one fire to the next, from one pair of hands to another, forward through time in an unbroken chain that had no single origin point you could point to and say, here is where the fire began. The same was true of the knowledge Halvard to Sigrun, Sigrun to the next to whoever came after. Not unbroken, there were gaps, always, places where a chain thinned and nearly snapped, where the knowledge nearly went out as a fire goes out, when there is no one to tend it, but never fully gone, never completely lost, because somewhere, in some smithy, in some village, a fire was burning, and a pair of hands was working, and a pair of eyes was watching, and the knowledge was alive, present, moving forward. And 1,000 years from now, in a time she could not see, in a world she could not imagine, someone would hold a piece of iron that had been worked in this tradition, that carried in its grain the invisible record of everything that had been done to it, and they would look at it and wonder how it was made, and the wondering would lead to the questions, and the questions would lead to the answers, and the answers would lead back here, to the fire, to the hands, to the patient, unbroken transmission of a way of knowing the world that lived not in books but in bodies, not in records but in the work itself. Astrid looked at the sleeping children, the boy who wanted to be a smith, the girls who might become anything, all of them carrying in their small bodies the future that she could not see but trusted. The way you trust a fire that has been tending itself through the long night and shows no sign of going out. She pulled her shawl tight. She listened to the distant hammer for a moment longer, still ringing, still steady, still doing its particular and irreplaceable work in the cold and the dark. Then she closed her eyes. The fire breathed. The hammer rang. The night held everything, the sleeping village, and the frozen river, and the stars overhead, and the sword riding somewhere in the world, and the knowledge passing forward through time in the hands and eyes of the people who cared enough to keep it, held it all in its vast and patient dark, as the night always holds everything, and always has, and always will. Good night, traveler. Sleep now. The forge remembers, and the fire never goes out.